Brian and Stewie traveling through infinite parallel universes, including one where dogs rule humans, exposed viewers to the most reality-bending trip in cartoon history. Peter faking his own death only to have the actual Grim Reaper show up and force him to do Death's job turned a simple scam into existential chaos. Peter taking an IQ test and discovering he's legally, intellectually disabled led to him exploiting the system in the most outrageous ways possible. And those are just 3 of the unhinged Family Guy moments in this video. Can you imagine all the deranged stuff there is to uncover when we dive deep into 2 hours of Family Guy's most absurd ever episodes over the next 2 hours? I was certainly shocked by some of the stuff I found when I made this video, so if you're ready to be blown away by what's about to come, sit back, relax, maybe grab a Pawtucket Patriot. Hopefully, it's not expired like Peter's schemes. Let's begin with Rhode to the Multiverse. Rhode to the Multiverse. The concept of infinite parallel universes sounds like something from a science fiction movie, but Family Guy turned this mind-bending theory into one of their most creative episodes ever. Rhode to the Multiverse didn't just break the 4th wall, it shattered every wall imaginable and rebuilt them in the most ridiculous ways possible. The episode begins at a carnival where we see the Griffin family enjoying typical carnival activities. But this isn't your ordinary Family Guy setup. Stewie has been working on something special, a device that can transport him and Brian across different dimensions. What starts as Stewie showing off his scientific knowledge quickly becomes the wildest adventure the show had ever attempted. Stewie explains the multiverse theory to Brian with typical condescending confidence. According to his explanation, there are infinite universes existing alongside their own on parallel dimensional planes. Brian pretends to understand, but Stewie immediately calls him out for repeating the last few words, like he knew what was going on all along. This moment perfectly captures their dynamic, Stewie's genius, paired with Brian's intellectual insecurity. The first universe they visit shows them what their world would look like with just small changes. They encounter a version of Meg who is actually attractive, which Brian finds shocking. Stewie explains that in this universe, Meg has completely different physical attributes, yet she's still considered one of the less attractive people. The joke lands because it plays on the running gag of Meg being the family outcast, but flips it in an unexpected way. Their journey takes them to a Flintstone-style universe where everything revolves around rocks. The family speaks in the same exaggerated prehistoric style as the classic cartoon, with every sentence containing rock-based puns. Peter talks about rocks and wearing rock phylactics, while a frog character announces he's ribbited for pleasure. The humor comes from how perfectly Family Guy mimics the innocent yet suggestive wordplay that classic cartoons use to sneak adult jokes past censors. The Japanese universe presents a dark, alternate history where America never dropped atomic bombs on Japan during World War II. In this reality, Japanese culture dominated America instead. The family speaks in broken English with Japanese sentence structure, and the cultural differences are exaggerated to absurd levels. Peter demands food for his hungry penis, while Lois giggles after being punched. The scene pushes boundaries by showing extreme cultural stereotypes, but the absurdity makes it clear this is satire rather than genuine cultural commentary. One of the most memorable stops is the Disney universe, where everything becomes bright, colorful, and musical. Stewie and Brian are transformed into typical Disney characters with big eyes and cheerful expressions. They comment on how gaily they run and how wonderful everything feels. The animation style completely changes to match classic Disney films, with soft colors and whimsical character designs. However, the Disney universe reveals its dark side when Mort appears, and every character immediately identifies him as Jewish before violently attacking him. This moment exposes the anti-Semitic undertones that existed in some early Disney productions, using humor to make a serious point about historical prejudice in entertainment. The contrast between the beautiful animation and the ugly behavior creates an uncomfortable but effective commentary. The Robot Chicken universe provides a completely different animation style, using stop-motion figures. Chris gets excited seeing action figures of Thundercats, G.I. Joe, He-Man, and Transformers walking around. When Stewie asks how it feels to be on a major network for 30 seconds, Chris responds with profanity, a joke about Robot Chicken's late-night cable status compared to Family Guy's network television presence. They visit a post-apocalyptic universe where Frank Sinatra was never born, which prevented him from using his influence to get Kennedy elected. This allowed Nixon to win the 1960 election and badly handle the Cuban Missile Crisis, leading to World War III. The alternate history humor continues when Stewie mentions that Lee Harvey Oswald shot Mayor McCheese instead of Kennedy, complete with a cutaway showing Jackie Kennedy eating the remains of the McDonald's character. The low-resolution blocky universe presents characters that look like early video game graphics. Everyone speaks in short, simple sentences and ends each interaction with "nya." The primitive animation style and repetitive dialogue create humor through their stark contrast with Family Guy's usual detailed animation and rapid-fire jokes. Other universe stops include one filled entirely with fire hydrants that Brian loves, another filled with attractive men that Stewie prefers, and a live-action universe that feels uncomfortably realistic. Each universe serves as both a visual gag and commentary on different forms of entertainment or social concepts. The dog universe provides the episode's biggest role reversal. Here, dogs are the intelligent species, while humans are pets. Brian meets his human counterpart and watches Stewie act like a typical pet dog, including demanding that Brian pick up his waste. The power dynamic flip forces both characters to experience life from a completely different perspective. Dog Stewie reveals he has also mastered multiverse travel and can navigate with perfect precision, unlike Stewie's random jumping. This discovery leads to the revelation that Stewie had accidentally left the device on shuffle mode, explaining their chaotic journey through different realities. The episode concludes with them returning home, bringing human Brian from the dog universe with them. Human Brian expresses hope about starting a new life in their world, noting his advantages as a white person in American society, a blunt acknowledgement of racial privilege. However, his optimistic speech is immediately cut short when he gets hit by a car, providing a dark punchline that returns the episode to Family Guy's typical irreverent tone. Rhode to the Multiverse works on multiple levels. It showcases the show's animation capabilities by requiring completely different art styles for each universe. It provides social commentary on everything from Disney's problematic history to racial dynamics in America. Most importantly, it delivers consistent laughs while maintaining the core relationship between Stewie and Brian that drives the best Family Guy episodes. The episode demonstrates why the Rhode 2 series became fan favorites. By removing the characters from their familiar environment, the writers could explore new dynamics and push creative boundaries. The multiverse concept allowed them to parody different animation styles, historical periods, and cultural phenomena all within a single episode. Rhode to the Multiverse takes Stewie and Brian on a dimension-hopping adventure through infinite parallel universes, each with its own unique twist on reality. From a Disney-style world with dark secrets to a universe where dogs rule humans, the episode showcases creative animation styles while delivering social commentary and classic Family Guy humor, ultimately bringing them home with an unexpected guest whose optimistic future gets immediately crushed. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Stewie is enchante. The idea of a baby getting pregnant sounds like something that could only exist in the most twisted corners of science fiction, but Family Guy took this impossible concept and turned it into one of their most disturbing and memorable episodes. Stewie as enchante didn't just push boundaries, it obliterated them completely and rebuilt them in ways that made viewers question everything they thought they knew about animated comedy. The episode opens with what seems like a normal morning in the Griffin household. Brian encounters Stewie, who greets him cheerfully with his typical, "Good morning, Brian." However, something feels off immediately. Brian's enhanced canine senses pick up an unusual smell that he can't quite identify at first. The tension builds as Brian tries to figure out what's causing this strange odor that's filling the room. When Brian mentions smelling something that resembles urine, Stewie confirms his suspicion with unsettling enthusiasm. The reveal comes when Stewie produces a pregnancy test showing a positive result. This moment creates immediate confusion because pregnancy tests aren't something you'd typically find in a baby's possession, let alone a positive one. Brian's first instinct is to assume the test belongs to Lois, which would make perfect sense given the Griffin family's history of unexpected pregnancies. When Stewie denies this possibility, Brian's next logical guess is Meg, the teenage daughter who would be more likely to find herself in such a situation. Stewie's response that he's getting warmer creates an ominous sense of dread about where this revelation is heading. The truth hits like a freight train when Stewie announces that he and Brian are pregnant together. This statement defies every law of biology, physics, and basic common sense. Brian's horrified reaction perfectly mirrors what viewers are experiencing, complete shock at the impossibility of what they're witnessing. The situation becomes even more surreal when Stewie mentions their future child moving away in 18 years, treating this bizarre pregnancy as if it's a completely normal family planning discussion. Stewie's matter-of-fact attitude about the entire situation adds another layer of absurdity. He approaches this biological impossibility with the same scientific curiosity he applies to his other inventions and experiments. When he asks Dr. Hartman to perform tests to determine if the baby will be an imbecile or a cretin, he's using outdated and offensive medical terminology with characteristic bluntness. The doctor's casual response about warehousing people with disabilities reflects the show's tendency to highlight society's problematic attitudes through shocking dialogue. Dr. Hartman's examination scene showcases the show's ability to find humor in uncomfortable medical situations. His unprofessional approach to prenatal care, including his comment about strictly eyeballing the patient, demonstrates the incompetence that makes him a recurring source of medical mishaps throughout the series. Brian's question about stairs in the building reveals his growing desperation and possibly suicidal thoughts about the situation he finds himself in. The pregnancy symptoms Stewie experiences mirror those of actual expectant mothers, but filtered through his sophisticated vocabulary and particular tastes. His cravings for red meat and specifically mint chip ice cream create a strange domestic scene where a genius baby discusses pregnancy symptoms with the family dog. Brian's observation that the food cravings are the one weird thing in all this provides dark humor by suggesting that everything else about the situation is perfectly normal. The birth scene takes the episode's absurdity to its ultimate conclusion. Having Stewie give birth in Brian's car adds another layer of chaos to an already impossible situation. Mayor Adam West's appearance with his Mazel Tov, congratulations, provides a moment of bizarre celebration for this unnatural event. West's characteristic obliviousness to unusual situations makes him the perfect witness to something that should be medically impossible. Cleveland's casual observation about Stewie's pregnant appearance when talking to Peter reveals how the community has begun to notice something unusual about the Griffin household. Peter's response that Lois is in charge of the kids shows his typical detachment from family responsibilities and his inability to recognize when something extraordinary is happening right under his nose. The subplot involving Peter's attempt to create viral internet content provides a stark contrast to the main storyline's biological impossibility. When Joe suggests that cats are essential ingredients for viral videos, it reflects real internet culture where cat content consistently attracts massive audiences. This seemingly normal discussion about online fame feels almost refreshing compared to the main plot's disturbing developments. However, even the viral video subplot takes an uncomfortable turn when Peter recalls a video of a monkey performing a sex act on a frog at the zoo. This reference pushes into territory that blends animal behavior with sexual content, creating the kind of inappropriate humor that Family Guy uses to shock audiences. Joe's confused response about that frog leads to a flashback that shows a female frog in suggestive clothing and behavior. The scene with the female frog dancing seductively while male monkeys watch creates uncomfortable parallels to human sexual exploitation. The frog's blonde wig and miniskirt transform animal behavior into something that resembles human adult entertainment. Peter's excitement about filming this interaction on his phone reveals his willingness to exploit situations for personal gain without considering the consequences. Joe's concern that the frog's in more danger than she realizes introduces an element of genuine worry into what initially seemed like harmless animal behavior. This shift in tone suggests that what appears entertaining on the surface might actually represent something more serious and potentially harmful. The moral complexity adds depth to what could have been a simple throwaway gag. The episode's exploration of pregnancy themes through impossible circumstances allows the writers to examine societal attitudes toward reproduction, family planning, and medical care. By making the situation so absurd that it can't exist in reality, they create space to discuss serious topics without being preachy or overly political. Stewie's approach to his pregnancy reflects his character's tendency to treat extraordinary situations as scientific experiments. His detailed attention to symptoms and medical procedures shows the same methodical thinking he applies to his world domination plans and time travel devices. The pregnancy becomes another project for him to manage and control. Brian's horror throughout the episode represents the voice of reason in an unreasonable situation. His questions about building stairs suggest he's considering ending his own life rather than dealing with the consequences of this impossible pregnancy. The psychological impact on Brian demonstrates how even the most absurd Family Guy storylines can have emotional weight. The medical aspects of the episode satirize healthcare systems and professional competence. Dr. Hartman's casual approach to what should be a medical emergency reflects broader concerns about healthcare quality and professional standards. His willingness to treat an impossible pregnancy as routine exposes the absurdity of medical bureaucracy. The community's gradual awareness of Stewie's condition shows how unusual events can become normalized when people don't know how to process them. Cleveland's observation treats the pregnancy as noteworthy but not alarming, suggesting that Quohog residents have become accustomed to strange occurrences in their neighborhood. Stewie is enchante presents the impossible scenario of Stewie becoming pregnant with Brian's child, exploring themes of reproduction, medical care, and social acceptance through completely absurd circumstances. While Peter attempts to create viral internet content involving questionable animal behavior, Stewie approaches his pregnancy with scientific curiosity despite Brian's horror. The episode combines biological impossibility with genuine pregnancy symptoms and medical procedures, creating dark humor that examines serious topics through the safety of complete fantasy, ultimately delivering one of Family Guy's most memorable and disturbing storylines. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Back to the Pilot, time travel stories usually involve heroes saving the world or preventing disasters, but Family Guy turned this classic concept into something completely different. Back to the Pilot takes viewers on a journey that starts as simple nostalgia, but quickly becomes one of the most chaotic and meta episodes the show ever produced. The episode begins with Brian and Stewie using Stewie's time machine to travel back to the very first Family Guy episode that aired in 1999. What starts as a trip down memory lane immediately becomes uncomfortable when they realize how different everything looked back then. The animation quality, character designs, and even voice acting feel primitive compared to what the show became over the years. Standing outside their house, Brian notices something feels wrong, even though it's technically the same location. The differences become obvious when they hear Meg talking to Lois about wanting collagen injections for her thin lips. However, Meg's voice sounds completely different because she was originally voiced by Lacey Chabert instead of Mila Kunis, who took over the role later in the series. Stewie immediately comments on how strange Meg sounds, saying she sounds like someone who's about to give up a huge opportunity. This joke works on multiple levels because Lacey Chabert did leave the show for other projects, but it also pokes fun at the voice change that longtime viewers noticed. Brian responds by making fun of how Stewie looked in the pilot, comparing him to a prize at some Mexican church carnival because his character design was much cruder in early episodes. The pilot version of Stewie speaks in an even more elaborate vocabulary than usual, using phrases like cursed ovarian Bastille to describe his mother's womb and mentioning his deeply laid plans for escape. When Brian asks if he carried a thesaurus around, pilot Stewie responds with a disturbing comment about his circumcision still healing, which adds an uncomfortable edge to his sophisticated speech patterns. One of the episode's most memorable moments comes when the pilot versions of the Griffin family set up what should be cutaway gags. In early Family Guy episodes, characters would reference past events that would then be shown as flashback scenes. However, when pilot Lois mentions Peter getting drunk on communion wine at church, nothing happens. The family just stands there motionless, like zombies. Brian and Stewie watch in confusion as the pilot family freezes in place multiple times when trying to set up these cutaways. The modern versions don't understand what's happening and even consider calling an ambulance because the behavior seems so unnatural. When pilot Lois mentions that time at the ice cream store, another awkward pause follows, where everyone just stares ahead blankly. The revelation comes when pilot Brian emerges to mention Peter having an Irish coffee when they saw the movie Philadelphia, and the family freezes again. Stewie finally realizes they're setting up fucking cutaways in the old style where characters had to pause and wait for the flashback scenes to play. This moment brilliantly exposes how mechanical and unnatural the show's early structure actually was. The contrast becomes even more apparent when the scene cuts to the modern Griffin family living room. When current Peter sets up a cutaway about a shifty salesman, instead of waiting motionless, everyone multitasks. Brian drinks from a flask, Peter smokes a cigarette, Lois applies makeup, and the kids text on their phones. Peter even comments that they have time because it's an Al Harrington. It goes on for a while, referencing a recurring character whose lengthy advertisements became running gags. The time travel plot thickens when pilot Stewie discovers current Stewie hiding under his bed while assembling his tuna fish sandwich rifle from the original episode. The meeting between past and future versions of the same character creates an awkward confrontation where current Stewie has to prove his identity. He does this by referencing the Eddie Bauer catalog, apparently something only Stewie would know about himself. Brian's attempt to prevent the September 11th attacks creates the episode's most controversial storyline. By using future knowledge to stop the terrorist plot, Brian becomes a celebrated hero in the alternate timeline. News reports show him on the plane using a baseball bat to fight terrorists, while delivering prepared catchphrases like, "Mohammed Atta stayed home," and "Houston, we have a solution." Stewie points out how inappropriate Brian's heroic one-liners are, noting that nobody knows Mohammed Atta's name yet, and that Houston's for space, not everyday air travel. The scene highlights how Brian's knowledge of future events makes his heroism feel artificial and self-serving rather than genuinely brave. His final line, "Seacrest out," shows how he's treating this serious situation like entertainment. The consequences of Brian's intervention become clear when they return to their present timeline. The world has changed dramatically because preventing 9/11 altered the course of history in unexpected ways. News reports mention follow-up terrorist attacks on different targets, suggesting that stopping one tragedy didn't prevent others from occurring. The timeline becomes increasingly unstable as more versions of Brian and Stewie appear from different attempts to fix their mistakes. Multiple duplicates argue about what should be done, creating a chaotic scene where nobody can keep track of who comes from which timeline. The situation becomes so confusing that even the characters admit they can't follow what's happening anymore. Stewie finally takes control by standing on a trash can and demanding everyone vote on whether to prevent 9/11 or let it happen. The democratic approach to handling time travel paradoxes creates dark humor, as characters literally vote on historical tragedies. When the vote count comes out to an odd number instead of even, they discover that one of the Brian duplicates died with his throat slit, adding more chaos to an already impossible situation. The resolution involves Stewie sending themselves back to the exact moment before their original arrival to prevent the entire mess from starting. Armed with a gun, he threatens their past selves to return to their own time and stay there. The violent confrontation between different versions of the same characters shows how desperate the situation has become. When past Brian questions the aggressive approach, Stewie shoots him in the leg to prove his seriousness. The willingness to harm his past self demonstrates how far Stewie will go to restore the timeline. His threat of, "You gonna flap your lips," or "You gonna do what I said," shows the tough guy attitude he adopts when dealing with time travel complications. The episode ends with Brian and Stewie back in their original timeline, with Brian nursing a wounded leg from the encounter with their future selves. Stewie explains that successful timeline restoration should erase all the alternate versions they created, but warns that time travel always carries risks of altering reality in unexpected ways. However, the final scene reveals that their adventure wasn't completely successful. Peter and his drinking buddies from 1999 suddenly appear in the present, indicating that some elements from the past have followed them forward in time. Peter's casual announcement that they need the couch to watch the game suggests that temporal displacement has become just another minor inconvenience in the Griffin household. Back to the Pilot succeeds as both nostalgia trip and meta commentary on how Family Guy evolved over the years. By literally returning to their origins, the characters expose the mechanical nature of early comedy writing while showing how much more sophisticated the show's humor became. The time travel plot allows for genuine character development while maintaining the irreverent tone that defines the series. Back to the Pilot sends Brian and Stewie back to Family Guy's first episode, where they discover how awkward and mechanical early comedy writing was compared to modern standards. Brian's attempt to prevent 9/11 creates timeline chaos with multiple character duplicates arguing about historical events, forcing Stewie to violently threaten their past selves to restore order. The episode serves as both nostalgic throwback and meta-commentary on the show's evolution, ending with temporal displacement becoming just another everyday problem for the Griffin family. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Petarded, the line between confidence and delusion becomes dangerously thin when someone gets a little taste of success. Petarded explores what happens when Peter Griffin discovers he might be smarter than he thought, only to learn that intelligence tests can reveal uncomfortable truths about ourselves that we never expected. The episode begins with Peter feeling intellectually superior after winning a game of Trivial Pursuit. This small victory inflates his ego to massive proportions, causing him to adopt pretentious language and condescending attitudes toward everyone around him. He starts using phrases like shallow and pedantic to describe everything from political commentary on television to Lois's meatloaf at dinner. Peter's newfound intellectual arrogance becomes insufferable for his family. When Brian asks if he's going to talk down to everyone just because he won a board game, Peter responds with a smug, perhaps, showing how quickly success can corrupt someone's personality. The dinner table scene where he criticizes Lois's cooking using fancy vocabulary demonstrates how he's using big words to mask the same petty complaints he's always had. Brian's question to Lois about whether she ever thinks about being married to Peter leads to a disturbing revelation. Lois admits she usually just represses these thoughts rather than dealing with them directly. When Brian asks if that's healthy, her response of, "What's the worst that could happen?" triggers a visual representation of her psychological state, a tumor in her head that sings with Peter's voice, suggesting that her repressed frustrations about her marriage are literally eating away at her mental health. Peter's arrogance reaches new heights when he decides to take an official IQ test to prove his intellectual superiority. The testing process reveals just how overconfident he's become. When the examiner asks simple questions, Peter approaches them with unnecessary complexity, turning basic queries into elaborate thought exercises that demonstrate his actual confusion rather than his supposed brilliance. The results of the IQ test shatter Peter's inflated self-image completely. Instead of confirming his genius status, the test reveals that he's legally classified as intellectually disabled. This devastating news turns his world upside down. As he puts it, black is east, up is white. The discovery forces him to confront the reality that his moment of trivia success was just a lucky break rather than evidence of hidden intelligence. Brian's reaction to Peter's test results shows a darker side of their friendship. Despite usually being the voice of reason, Brian can't resist celebrating Peter's comeuppance with vicious enthusiasm. His screaming, "In your fucking face, fuckwad," reveals how much Peter's condescending behavior hurt him. The outburst is followed by immediate regret, showing how toxic dynamics can bring out the worst in even well-intentioned people. Peter's response to his diagnosis demonstrates his tendency to take any situation to inappropriate extremes. Instead of quietly dealing with his classification, he starts calling people from his past to inform them about his condition. His phone call to Sally from senior prom, suggesting she might want to get yourself tested, as if intellectual disability were contagious, shows his fundamental misunderstanding of what the diagnosis actually means. The conversation with Joe Swanson creates an awkward moment that highlights Peter's lack of social awareness. When Peter asks Joe how he deals with being intellectually disabled, Joe has to explain the difference between being physically handicapped and having cognitive limitations. Peter's response that Joe is just splitting hairs demonstrates his inability to grasp important distinctions even when they're explained clearly. Peter begins exploiting his new classification in ways that reveal both his selfishness and his misunderstanding of disability rights. He uses his status to get out of responsibilities and gain special treatment, treating his diagnosis like a get-out-of-jail-free card rather than understanding the real challenges that people with intellectual disabilities face. The family's reaction to Peter's diagnosis varies dramatically. Chris celebrates that they can live with Peter again, even though you are a dangerous person with intellectual disabilities, showing how children often accept dramatic changes more easily than adults. Meg feels humiliated by the situation, worried about how it will affect her already difficult social life at school. Stewie delivers one of his most brutal assessments when Meg complains about being unable to return to school. He points out that this situation isn't what will ruin her reputation, given her years of grotesque appearance and awkward social graces. His threat that he might kill you tonight shows how Peter's situation has made everyone in the family more volatile and cruel toward each other. Peter's attempt to turn his diagnosis into a superiority complex reveals his inability to learn from experience. He starts calling intellectually disabled people little people and claims they are superior to dumb, brainy smarties. His declaration that normal people will someday beg us for mercy shows how he transforms any situation into a power fantasy rather than accepting reality. The episode includes several scenes that push boundaries around disability representation. Peter's behavior in restaurants, where he grabs microphones and shouts inappropriate things, creates uncomfortable situations for everyone involved. These moments highlight real issues about how society treats people with disabilities while using Peter's extreme behavior for dark comedy. A board game scene featuring what appears to be a civil rights-themed game creates additional controversy. Peter reads a card saying, "For whistling at a white woman, go directly to jail," and complains that nobody ever wins. Cleveland's response that, "You don't win, you just do a little better each time," provides sobering commentary on historical and ongoing racial injustice, delivered through the lens of a board game parody. The climax involves Peter participating in some kind of competition where Lois coaches him through answering simple questions. When she asks him to say the word "what," Peter turns it into an elaborate mental exercise involving the Fantastic Four and steak before finally arriving at the correct answer. His victory celebration shows how even basic achievements can feel monumental when expectations are adjusted. The episode's resolution doesn't provide easy answers about intelligence, dignity, or family dynamics. Peter's classification as intellectually disabled doesn't change his fundamental personality, impulsive. He's still selfish, impulsive, and prone to taking things too far. However, the diagnosis does force his family to confront their own attitudes about intelligence, success, and what makes people valuable. The medical aspects of the episode raise questions about how intelligence testing works and what these classifications actually mean for people's lives. By showing Peter's extreme reactions to both high and low assessments of his abilities, the episode suggests that self-worth shouldn't depend entirely on test scores or academic achievements. Petard follows Peter's journey from intellectual arrogance after winning Trivial Pursuit to devastating humiliation when an IQ test reveals he's legally classified as intellectually disabled. The episode explores themes of intelligence, family dynamics, and disability rights through Peter's extreme reactions to both success and failure. While Brian celebrates Peter's comeuppance and the family struggles with embarrassment, Peter attempts to exploit his new status for personal gain, ultimately learning that test scores don't define a person's fundamental character or worth. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Death is a Bitch. What starts as a simple scheme to avoid paying medical bills quickly spirals into cosmic chaos when Peter Griffin accidentally summons the one entity you definitely don't want to mess with. Death is a Bitch proves that even the most mundane acts of dishonesty can have universe-altering consequences. The episode begins when Peter discovers a lump on his chest and fears he might have cancer. This health scare forces him to confront his own mortality for the first time, leading to dramatic declarations about appreciating life and family. However, when medical tests reveal the lump is just a benign fatty tumor, Peter's relief quickly turns into anger about the expensive hospital bill he now faces. Rather than simply paying the medical costs like a responsible adult, Peter hatches what he considers a brilliant plan. He decides to fake his own death, reasoning that dead people don't have to pay their debts. This scheme requires him to stage an elaborate deception that convinces everyone, including his own family, that he has actually died. Peter's fake death performance is so convincing that it attracts the attention of Death himself. The Grim Reaper, voiced by Norm Macdonald with perfectly deadpan delivery, arrives at the Griffin household, expecting to collect Peter's soul. Death appears as the classic hooded figure with a scythe, but his personality is more like a tired, sarcastic office worker than a terrifying supernatural force. The plan backfires spectacularly when Death discovers that Peter is actually alive. However, before Death can correct this mistake, he accidentally injures his ankle while trying to apprehend the fake corpse. This injury leaves Death unable to perform his cosmic duties, creating a situation where the natural order of life and death stops functioning properly. Death explains to Peter that his injury has serious consequences for the entire world. Without Death actively maintaining the balance between life and death, people can no longer die from injuries or illnesses that would normally be fatal. This sounds like good news at first, but Death warns that the disruption of natural order will eventually lead to catastrophic problems for humanity. The consequences of Death's absence become apparent through news reports showing people surviving impossible situations. The local news team covers stories of individuals walking away from fatal accidents completely unharmed. Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons treat these miraculous survivals as fascinating human interest stories, rather than recognizing the cosmic crisis they represent. Peter initially refuses to help Death recover, pointing out the obvious conflict of interest in assisting someone whose job involves killing him. However, Death's helpless condition and the growing chaos in the world gradually convince Peter that he needs to take responsibility for the mess he created through his dishonest scheme. Death's presence in the Griffin household creates awkward domestic situations. His sarcastic commentary on family life and impatient demands for assistance make him an unwelcome guest who can't be asked to leave. The family must navigate normal daily routines while harboring the personification of mortality in their living room. The episode explores Peter's relationship with his family through the lens of his fake death. Lois experiences genuine grief over losing her husband, while the children react in characteristically dysfunctional ways. Stewie celebrates Peter's apparent demise, while Chris and Meg struggle with their complex feelings about their father's death. When Peter realizes that his actions have global consequences, he agrees to help Death restore the natural order. However, Death explains that simply healing his ankle won't be enough. To convince the world that Death still has power, they need to stage a dramatic demonstration that will capture public attention and restore fear of mortality. Death suggests that Peter should kill someone famous to prove that death still applies to everyone. This leads to a discussion about potential targets, with various family members offering suggestions. The conversation takes a darkly comic turn as they casually debate which celebrities would make the best victims for their cosmic reset plan. Peter becomes fixated on the idea of killing the cast of Dawson's Creek, the popular teen drama that was airing at the time. He claims he always predicted he would be the one to eliminate these young actors, treating his potential murders as vindication of his television viewing preferences rather than serious crimes. However, when Peter actually encounters James Van Der Beek and other cast members in person, he discovers that he can't bring himself to commit murder. His moral compass, despite being somewhat broken, still prevents him from killing innocent people, regardless of his personal opinions about their television show. The crisis resolves when Death's ankle heals naturally, allowing him to resume his duties without requiring Peter to become a killer. The natural order of life and death returns to normal, and people around the world regain their ability to die from injuries and illnesses. Death's departure from the Griffin household comes with ominous warnings about future encounters. He reminds Peter that death is inevitable for everyone, and that their paths will cross again eventually. His casual threat that he'll be back really, really soon serves as both comedy and genuine menace. The episode concludes with the family returning to their normal routines, but with a new understanding of how Peter's selfish decisions can have far-reaching consequences. His attempt to avoid paying a medical bill nearly destroyed the cosmic balance between life and death, demonstrating how seemingly small acts of dishonesty can spiral out of control. Peter's character development throughout the episode shows his evolution from selfish schemer to someone who accepts responsibility for his actions. While he doesn't become a completely different person, he does learn that his choices affect more than just himself and his immediate family. The voice acting by Norm Macdonald as Death became one of the episode's most memorable elements. His delivery of sarcastic, world-weary dialogue made Death feel like a bureaucrat dealing with incompetent clients rather than an otherworldly force. This characterization removed much of the fear typically associated with death, while maintaining respect for its importance. Death is a Bitch works as both supernatural comedy and commentary on healthcare costs, personal responsibility, and the consequences of dishonesty. The episode takes an absurd premise and follows it to its logical conclusion, while maintaining the show's signature blend of dark humor and family dysfunction. Death is a Bitch follows Peter's scheme to fake his death to avoid medical bills, which accidentally summons the real Grim Reaper, who injures himself and becomes unable to perform his duties. With death no longer functioning worldwide, Peter must help death restore the natural order, while learning that his dishonest actions can have universe-altering consequences. The episode combines supernatural elements with domestic comedy, ultimately teaching Peter about responsibility, while featuring Norm Macdonald's memorable performance as a sarcastic, world-weary Death. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Da Boom, Peter Griffin pushing his pregnant wife down basement stairs during a fake apocalypse represents one of Family Guy's most disturbing moments of domestic violence disguised as comedy. Da Boom takes the Y2K panic and transforms it into a twisted exploration of how quickly civilization crumbles when people believe the world has ended. The episode aired during the height of Y2K hysteria in 1999, when millions of Americans genuinely feared that computer glitches would collapse society on January 1st, 2000. Seth MacFarlane used this cultural moment to examine what happens when ordinary people like Peter Griffin are given power during a crisis. The premise seems innocent enough, a family preparing for potential Y2K problems by stocking their basement with supplies. But the episode quickly reveals itself as a commentary on how emergency situations expose people's worst impulses. Peter's transformation begins subtly, with typical Griffin ignorance. When he hears about Y2K, he asks, "What are you selling, chicken or sex jelly?" showing his complete disconnect from reality. This ignorance becomes dangerous as the episode progresses. Peter stockpiles Twinkies because he believes only cockroaches and Twinkies can survive nuclear holocaust, demonstrating how misinformation spreads during panic. His casual racism emerges when Brian mentions people eating Asian reporter Trisha Takanawa, and Peter responds, "They're just gonna be hungry again in an hour," a joke that relies on harmful stereotypes about Asian food. The violence escalates when Peter suspects Lois might be pregnant. Without any discussion or consideration, he immediately pushes her down the basement stairs. This moment is particularly disturbing because Peter treats potential pregnancy as an inconvenience to be eliminated through violence. The transcript shows Lois screaming as she falls, but Peter shows zero remorse or concern for her well-being. This scene crosses the line from slapstick comedy into genuine domestic abuse, yet the episode treats it as just another Peter Griffin mishap. After the fake nuclear blast, Peter's behavior becomes increasingly authoritarian. He takes credit for finding the Twinkie factory and starting their post-apocalyptic community, positioning himself as their savior and leader. Peter's ego inflates as he claims responsibility for teaching elocution to Rosie Perez, then immediately mocks her accent in a racist impression. The power corrupts him quickly. He makes unilateral decisions about who can join their group and what resources they can bring. The most chilling moment occurs when Peter takes care of Chris's plant friend, Woody. Peter leads the plant behind a building, a gunshot rings out, and he returns claiming nothing happened. This scene mirrors execution scenarios and shows Peter casually committing murder over resource concerns. Chris trusted his father to care for his beloved plant, but Peter killed it without hesitation. The betrayal of his own son's trust reveals how completely Peter has abandoned normal moral boundaries. Da Boom's long-term impact on Family Guy established a pattern of using extreme scenarios to justify increasingly violent comedy. The episode proved audiences would accept domestic violence, racism, and casual murder if presented within the show's irreverent tone. Peter pushing Lois downstairs became a template for future episodes where spousal abuse gets played for laughs. The show learned it could push boundaries around violence against women by framing Peter as too stupid to understand his actions' consequences. The episode also normalized the idea that men become natural leaders during emergencies, even when they're completely unqualified. Peter's ascension to community leader, despite his obvious incompetence, reflects real-world dynamics where confident men assume authority during crises, regardless of their actual abilities. The transcript shows other characters deferring to Peter's decisions, even when they clearly disagree, demonstrating how quickly people surrender agency to authoritarian figures during stressful situations. Most troubling is how the episode treats Peter's violence as inevitable rather than choice-based. When he pushes Lois downstairs, the show presents it as typical Peter behavior rather than a serious assault. This framing removes accountability and suggests that some people just naturally resort to violence when stressed. Daboom established that Peter Griffin could commit increasingly severe acts without facing consequences, setting up decades of similar storylines where his actions hurt others but he never learns or changes. The fake apocalypse scenario also allowed the writers to explore themes of social collapse without real-world consequences. Since the Y2K threat turned out to be false, Peter's actions exist in a consequence-free bubble, where domestic violence and murder become temporary problems that reset by episode's end. This structure became a Family Guy hallmark, Sicha, using extreme situations to justify extreme behavior, then returning everything to normal without addressing the trauma inflicted. Daboom ultimately reveals how thin the veneer of civilization really is, especially for people like Peter Griffin who already struggle with basic empathy and impulse control. The episode suggests that crisis situations bring out people's true nature rather than corrupting good people. Peter was always capable of violence against his family. The fake apocalypse just gave him permission to act on those impulses without social consequences. The episode's legacy extends beyond Family Guy into broader conversations about how media normalizes domestic violence through comedy. By presenting Peter's abuse of Lois as a punchline rather than a serious issue, Daboom contributed to cultural acceptance of violence against women when framed as humor. The show's continued popularity, despite these elements, demonstrates how audiences can compartmentalize problematic content when it comes packaged with entertainment they enjoy. Daboom is Family Guy's Y2K episode, where Peter Griffin's behavior escalates from ignorant preparation to violent authoritarianism during a fake apocalypse. Key disturbing moments include Peter pushing pregnant Lois down basement stairs, executing Chris's pet plant Woody with a gunshot, and appointing himself dictator of a post-apocalyptic Twinkie-based community. The episode uses the Y2K panic to explore how crisis situations expose people's worst impulses, with Peter's domestic violence and casual murder played for laughs rather than treated as serious crimes. It established Family Guy's pattern of using extreme scenarios to justify increasingly violent comedy while avoiding real consequences. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Rhode to the North Pole. Family Guy's Christmas episode, Rhode to the North Pole, stands out as one of the show's most disturbing holiday specials, combining violent assault, inappropriate cancer jokes, and racist humor into a twisted journey that exposes the darkness beneath Christmas cheer. The episode follows Stewie Griffin's murderous quest to kill Santa Claus after a disappointing mall experience, dragging Brian along on a cross-country adventure that quickly spirals into criminal behavior and emotional trauma. The episode begins with typical Family Guy holiday setup, Dia Men, families waiting in line to see Mall Santa, while Peter Griffin acts like a child himself. Peter's wish list includes wanting a pet that's half chinchilla and half mink, so he can call it Chink, immediately establishing the episode's willingness to use racial slurs for cheap laughs. This casual racism sets the tone for an episode that will repeatedly cross lines of decency while treating serious issues as punchlines. Stewie's motivation comes from standard Mall Santa disappointment, but his reaction escalates far beyond normal childhood frustration. When Brian suggests that maybe Santa just made a mistake, Stewie declares his intention to travel to the North Pole and kill that bastard. This isn't typical Stewie scheming. He's planning actual murder over Christmas presents. Brian tries reasoning with Stewie by explaining Santa doesn't exist, but Stewie responds with a bizarre rant comparing Santa to fictional characters like SpongeBob and Curious George, showing his complete disconnection from reality. Their journey north introduces a series of increasingly problematic encounters that highlight the episode's poor judgment around sensitive topics. When they meet a helpful Canadian who offers assistance with their broken car, Stewie immediately assumes the man's offer to get a hose means hiring Latino workers named Jose. This racist misunderstanding plays into harmful stereotypes, while the Canadian character speaks entirely in A sounds, reducing an entire nationality to a single verbal tick. The scene stretches these offensive jokes far beyond their comedic value. The Canadian's extreme generosity, next place, offering his snowmobile, money, and even his leg, parodies Canadian politeness stereotypes, but also serves the plot by getting Stewie and Brian closer to their destination. However, this generosity enables their increasingly violent mission, making the helpful stranger an unwitting accomplice to their later crimes. The episode treats his kindness as a joke rather than recognizing how his assistance facilitates actual violence. When Stewie and Brian finally reach what they believe is Santa's workshop, they discover a dystopian industrial operation where Santa explains the impossibility of modern toy production. Santa's complaint about making iPods instead of wooden choo-choos and rag dolls serves as commentary on holiday commercialization, but the episode doesn't explore these themes deeply enough to justify the journey's violent elements. Instead, it uses Santa's exhaustion to excuse the poor Christmas experience that started Stewie's murderous rampage. The episode's most disturbing sequence occurs when Stewie and Brian break into what they think is the right house to deliver presents as substitute Santas. When homeowner Dan discovers them and threatens to call police, Brian attempts to explain their presence with an obviously false story about coming down the chimney without presents. Before Brian can finish his explanation, Stewie brutally attacks Dan with a baseball bat, knocking him unconscious and causing enough bleeding that Stewie later mentions cleaning up the last of the blood. This assault scene crosses every line of acceptable comedy. Stewie doesn't just hit Dan once in panic, he beats him severely enough to cause significant bleeding and potential brain damage. The attack is premeditated and calculated, not accidental or slapstick. When Brian expresses horror at the violence, Stewie justifies it by saying, "You can't call the cops on Santa," showing he's completely detached from the reality that he just committed felony assault on an innocent person trying to protect his home from intruders. The situation becomes even more horrifying when Stewie mentions checking on Johnny, the one who's getting the bat, implying he planned to assault a child with the same weapon he used on Dan. When Brian discovers there's only one bedroom and no boy named Johnny in the house, they realize they've invaded the wrong home entirely. This means they brutally attacked a completely innocent man for no reason whatsoever. The episode treats this revelation as a comedic misunderstanding rather than acknowledging they've committed serious crimes against random victims. Perhaps the episode's most emotionally cruel moment occurs when Brian and Stewie encounter Quagmire waiting in line with his young niece, Abby. Brian approaches the child and repeatedly refers to her as a little guy and buddy, asking if she's been a good boy this year. When Abby begins crying, Quagmire reveals she's his niece, whose hair is short due to chemotherapy treatments for cancer. Brian's assumption about her gender based on her appearance devastates a child already struggling with the visible effects of her illness. Quagmire's angry response reveals how much effort it took to convince Abby to leave the house despite her self-consciousness about her hair loss. Brian's thoughtless comments destroy all that progress, making a cancer patient feel worse about her appearance during what should be a happy Christmas experience. When Brian tries to apologize by saying he didn't know she was dying, he makes the situation exponentially worse by introducing the concept of death to a child who hadn't been thinking about mortality. The scene reaches peak cruelty when 5-year-old Abby asks Uncle Glenn, "Am I dying?" because of Brian's comment. Quagmire has to comfort his terrified niece while furiously ordering Brian to leave. This moment showcases how thoughtless adult behavior can traumatize children, especially those already dealing with serious illness. The episode uses a child's cancer struggle as setup for uncomfortable humor, rather than treating her condition with appropriate sensitivity. The episode's resolution attempts to provide redemption by having Stewie and Brian help Santa convince Quohog residents to accept just one Christmas gift per person per year. This solution supposedly fixes Santa's production problems while teaching lessons about holiday commercialization. However, this positive ending cannot undo the violence and cruelty that preceded it. Dan remains assaulted and traumatized, Abby's Christmas is ruined, and no one faces consequences for their harmful actions. The lasting impact of Rhode to the North Pole demonstrates Family Guy's willingness to exploit serious issues like childhood cancer and domestic violence for shock value comedy. The episode established that the show would use any topic, no matter how sensitive, as material for jokes without considering the real-world implications. Children with cancer watching this episode see their struggles mocked, while victims of home invasion witness their trauma played for laughs. The episode also normalizes extreme violence as an acceptable response to minor inconveniences. Stewie's progression from disappointed child to would-be murderer to actual assault perpetrator suggests that escalating violence is natural when people don't get what they want. By treating his assault on Dan as comedic rather than criminal, the show implies that violence becomes acceptable when committed by characters audiences are supposed to like. Most problematically, the episode presents redemption as possible without accountability. Stewie never faces consequences for assault. Brian never truly apologizes for traumatizing a cancer patient, and their final good deed supposedly balances out their earlier crimes. This structure teaches viewers that harmful actions can be erased through later positive behavior, avoiding the difficult work of taking responsibility and making amends to actual victims. Rhode to the North Pole represents Family Guy at its most ethically bankrupt, using Christmas themes to justify an episode filled with violence against innocents, cruelty towards sick children, and casual racism presented as humor. The episode's few moments of genuine social commentary about holiday commercialization get buried beneath layers of unnecessary cruelty that serve no comedic or narrative purpose beyond shock value. Rhode to the North Pole follows Stewie's violent quest to kill Santa Claus, resulting in him beating an innocent homeowner unconscious with a baseball bat during a botched break-in, while Brian traumatizes Quagmire's cancer patient niece by repeatedly misgendering her and suggesting she might be dying. The episode combines extreme violence with inappropriate cancer jokes and casual racism, ultimately teaching that good deeds can erase criminal behavior without consequences or accountability. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Blue Harvest. Family Guy's Blue Harvest episode represents the show's most ambitious parody project, retelling the entire original Star Wars film through the Griffin family characters, while simultaneously delivering meta-commentary about originality and derivative content creation. The episode combines crude sexual humor with nostalgic filmmaking references, ultimately becoming a vehicle for Seth MacFarlane to both celebrate and mock the very concept of pop culture parody. The episode begins with a power outage in Quohog, giving Peter the opportunity to entertain his family by retelling Star Wars with everyone cast as familiar characters. This framing device allows the show to justify an entire episode of borrowed material while positioning Peter as the creative storyteller adapting existing content for his audience. The setup mirrors Family Guy's own relationship with pop culture, taking established properties and filtering them through the show's irreverent perspective. From the opening moments, the episode establishes its willingness to sexualize inappropriate subjects through the golf commentary scene featuring objectifying remarks about Phil Mickelson's wife. The commentators discuss her body in explicitly sexual terms during what should be sports coverage, treating her as entertainment rather than a person. This opening sequence has no connection to the Star Wars story, but establishes the episode's crude tone and demonstrates how the show inserts sexual content into any context, regardless of appropriateness. The Star Wars parody itself begins with Princess Leia recording her famous message to Obi-Wan, but the scene quickly devolves into technical difficulties with video software. Lois as Princess Leia struggles with computer programs like Real Player, while Cleveland as R2D2 provides tech support, turning an iconic moment of desperation into mundane computer frustration. This sequence reflects how modern technology complicates simple tasks, while also dating the episode to a specific era of software problems. Stewie's portrayal of Darth Vader emphasizes his obsessive-compulsive tendencies and superiority complex, rather than the character's intimidating presence. When Vader arrives at the captured rebel ship, Stewie complains about the mess left by stormtroopers, treating galactic conquest like household management. This characterization reduces one of cinema's most iconic villains to a fussy child upset about cleanliness, undermining the dramatic tension essential to the original story. The episode's most disturbing elements emerge through Herbert the Pervert's casting as Obi-Wan Kenobi, transforming a wise mentor figure into a predatory character with obvious, inappropriate intentions toward young Luke. Herbert's dialogue includes references to showing Luke things with puppets and warnings not to tell anyone because you'll get in trouble, clearly alluding to sexual abuse scenarios. This casting choice turns the force training scenes into uncomfortable suggestions of grooming behavior. Peter as Han Solo provides the episode's most self-aware moment when he declares himself the only actor whose career wasn't destroyed by this movie, referencing the real-world impact Star Wars had on its cast members' subsequent careers. This meta-commentary acknowledges how the original film typecast its actors while positioning Peter as somehow exempt from similar consequences. The joke works on multiple levels by referencing both Star Wars history and Family Guy's own relationship with pop culture references. The technical aspects of the Star Wars universe become sources of mundane humor throughout the episode. When Luke questions why they call them TIE fighters, Han admits he has no idea, acknowledging the arbitrary nature of science fiction naming conventions. Similarly, Luke's correction that parsecs measure distance rather than time during the Kessel Run discussion highlights how the original films included scientific errors that fans have debated for decades. The lightsaber malfunction scene represents the episode's crudest sexual humor, with Obi-Wan's weapon becoming flaccid during his confrontation with Darth Vader until Luke's arrival causes it to become erect again. This juvenile penis joke reduces the saga's most elegant weapon to a crude sexual metaphor, while adding uncomfortable implications to the mentor-student relationship between Herbert and Chris's characters. The Death Star assault sequence includes an extended roll call parody featuring various Red references, from Red Buttons to Simply Red to Red October. This sequence demonstrates Family Guy's tendency to extend single jokes far beyond their comedic value, turning a brief Star Wars moment into an exhaustive list of pop culture references. The joke becomes less about Star Wars and more about how many Red references the writers can include. Cleveland's characterization as R2-D2 includes the episode's most jarring moment when he shoots down a TIE fighter with a handgun while shouting, "That's how we do it in my neighborhood." This line relies on racial stereotypes about urban violence while completely breaking the Star Wars universe's internal logic. The joke reduces Cleveland to a stereotype while undermining the science fiction setting through anachronistic weapon use. The episode's conclusion features a direct confrontation with Robot Chicken's similar Star Wars parody, with Chris pointing out that the Cartoon Network show had already covered the same material months earlier. This meta-discussion about derivative content and creative timing reveals Family Guy's awareness of its own unoriginality while attempting to dismiss the competition through elitist arguments about legitimate television networks. Peter's defensive response to accusations of copying Robot Chicken exposes the show's insecurity about its place in the television landscape. His dismissal of cable networks as illegitimate while claiming superiority for broadcast television reflects outdated industry hierarchies that were already crumbling when the episode aired. The argument reveals more about Family Guy's defensive posture than any meaningful critique of competing shows. The extended debate about Robot Chicken's legitimacy and audience size demonstrates how derivative content creators often compete through technical arguments rather than creative merit. Peter's claim that 15-minute episodes are somehow inferior ignores the possibility that concise storytelling might actually be preferable to bloated feature-length parodies. The discussion becomes less about content quality and more about industry positioning and audience metrics. Blue Harvest ultimately succeeds as both Star Wars parody and commentary on the derivative nature of modern pop culture content. The episode acknowledges its own unoriginality while simultaneously defending its right to retell familiar stories through different perspectives. However, the sexual content involving Herbert as Obi-Wan crosses ethical lines by introducing predatory themes into what should be innocent mentor relationships. The episode's treatment of women remains consistently problematic, from the golf commentary objectification to Princess Leia's reduced role as someone struggling with technology rather than leading a rebellion. These elements reflect Family Guy's broader issues with female representation, while demonstrating how parody can perpetuate harmful stereotypes even when adapting progressive source material. Most significantly, Blue Harvest establishes Family Guy's approach to extended pop culture parodies that prioritize references over narrative coherence. The episode proves audiences will accept familiar stories retold through crude humor and celebrity voice casting, setting a template for future Star Wars episodes and similar projects across animated television. The lasting impact of Blue Harvest extends beyond Family Guy into broader questions about derivative content creation and the value of parody in contemporary media. The episode demonstrates how established properties can be endlessly recycled through different comedic lenses, while raising questions about when homage becomes exploitation of existing intellectual property. Blue Harvest retells Star Wars: A New Hope through Family Guy characters, combining crude sexual humor with pop culture references while featuring disturbing elements like Herbert the Pervert as Obi-Wan making inappropriate comments to young Luke. The episode includes meta-commentary defending itself against accusations of copying Robot Chicken's similar parody, ultimately showcasing Family Guy's approach to derivative content that prioritizes shock value and references over original storytelling, while problematically sexualizing iconic characters and relationships from the beloved space opera. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to I Dream of Jesus. Family Guy's I Dream of Jesus episode centers on Peter Griffin's discovery of Jesus Christ working at a record store, leading to a bizarre friendship that explores themes of celebrity worship, religious commercialization, and Peter's unhealthy obsession with the 1,960 seconds novelty song, Surfin' Bird. The episode combines religious satire with crude humor, while examining how modern society treats both spiritual figures and pop culture artifacts as interchangeable commodities for personal gratification. The episode begins with the Griffin family at a 1,950 seconds themed diner, where Peter nostalgically declares that restaurants no longer serve 1,950 seconds food, like hamburgers, French fries, and Cokes, items that remain standard restaurant fare. This opening establishes Peter's disconnection from reality and tendency to romanticize arbitrary time periods, setting up his later obsession with a decades-old novelty record. His inability to recognize common foods as still widely available demonstrates the shallow nature of his nostalgic thinking. Peter's encounter with Jesus at the record store reveals both characters as surprisingly mundane. Jesus explains he visits Earth every 100 years or so incognito to escape family pressure, particularly because my dad just quit smoking and he's a little on edge. This portrayal reduces the divine to domestic dysfunction, with God depicted as an irritable ex-smoker rummaging through drawers looking for his checkbook while snapping at someone named Ellen about missing pen caps. The episode's central conflict emerges when Peter becomes obsessed with his Surfin' Bird record to the point of taking it to bed and having sex with it. This literal sexual relationship with an inanimate object crosses into disturbing territory, suggesting Peter suffers from object fetishism while treating a novelty song as more important than his human relationships. When the record disappears, Peter's reaction mirrors that of someone whose romantic partner has abandoned them. Peter's paranoid investigation into the missing record reveals his tendency toward conspiracy thinking and false accusations against his family. He constructs an elaborate theory involving Meg's supposed twin sister, sanitarium stays, and changed wills, demonstrating how obsessive behavior leads to increasingly disconnected thinking. His willingness to suspect his own children of theft over a novelty record shows how his priorities have become completely inverted. The episode's religious satire reaches controversial territory when Jesus appears on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno, where the host introduces him to 6 interchangeable women, while Jesus jokes that, "Last time I was down here on earth, I only hung around with one whore." This reference to Mary Magdalene combines biblical knowledge with crude sexual humor, while reducing both Jesus and the female guests to stereotypes about celebrity culture and religious figures. Jesus' integration into modern celebrity culture includes him working at a record store, appearing on talk shows, and eventually dating Lindsay Lohan, who is portrayed asking, "Who wants to do me?" after drinking beer and removing her top. This depiction reduces both religious figures and real celebrities to sexual objects, while commenting on how contemporary culture commodifies everyone, including supposed spiritual leaders. The episode's treatment of disability appears in a cutaway showing Marlee Matlin, a deaf actress, attempting to use Moviefone's voice recognition system. The scene mocks her speech patterns while she tries to say, "the last Mimsy," but gets matched with 300 instead. This extended joke relies on making fun of how deaf individuals speak, using a real person's disability as material for humor without considering the impact on deaf audiences. Peter's competitive relationship with Jesus manifests when he tries to top the crucifixion story with his own tale about staying sober enough to sit through Chronicles of Riddick without vomiting. This comparison trivializes religious sacrifice while elevating Peter's mundane experiences to equal importance with foundational Christian events. The casual Peter 1, Jesus 0 scorecard demonstrates Peter's inability to comprehend the significance of religious narratives. The episode explores themes of abandonment when Jesus eventually returns to heaven, leaving Peter devastated at the loss of his celebrity friend. However, Peter's grief quickly transforms into joy when he discovers Jesus has left him his surfin' bird record as a parting gift. This revelation suggests that Peter valued Jesus primarily as a means to recover his obsession object, rather than for any spiritual or personal connection. The religious satire extends beyond Christianity when the episode includes Mayor Adam West, demanding his scientists verify mathematically that the bird is equal to or greater than the word. This absurd scientific investigation of a novelty song lyric parodies how authority figures sometimes demand empirical proof for cultural phenomena while missing the point entirely. Throughout the episode, Peter's family tolerates his increasingly erratic behavior around both Jesus and his record obsession, suggesting how families often enable destructive fixations rather than confronting them directly. Lois, Brian, and the children make occasional comments about Peter's behavior, but take no meaningful action to address his obvious mental health issues or inappropriate sexual relationship with an inanimate object. The episode's conclusion reinforces Peter's obsessive nature when he immediately begins singing "Surfin' Bird" after recovering the record, with Stewie screaming "fuck" in frustration at the return of Peter's annoying behavior. This ending suggests that Peter learned nothing from his experience with Jesus and will simply resume his previous destructive patterns with renewed intensity. I Dream of Jesus ultimately satirizes both religious reverence and pop culture obsession by treating them as equivalent forms of worship. The episode suggests that people like Peter approach spiritual figures with the same shallow celebrity fascination they bring to entertainment, missing deeper meanings while focusing on personal gratification and social status. The episode's portrayal of mental health issues through Peter's obsessive behavior and paranoid thinking receives no serious treatment, instead being played for laughs, while his family enables his deteriorating condition. This approach reflects Family Guy's broader tendency to mock psychological problems rather than addressing them constructively. Most problematically, the episode's religious content offends multiple faith communities through crude sexual humor and irreverent treatment of sacred figures, while simultaneously mocking disability and reducing real people to stereotypes. The combination creates an episode that manages to be offensive on multiple levels, while offering little meaningful commentary beyond shock value. I Dream of Jesus follows Peter Griffin's friendship with Jesus Christ, whom he discovers working at a record store, while Peter simultaneously develops a sexual obsession with his Surfin' Bird record. The episode combines religious satire with crude humor, featuring Jesus's appearing on talk shows and dating Lindsay Lohan, Peter literally having sex with a vinyl record, and a cutaway mocking deaf actress Marlee Matlin's speech patterns. The story satirizes both celebrity worship and religious reverence by treating them as equivalent obsessions, ultimately revealing Peter's shallow approach to both spiritual figures and pop culture artifacts. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Three Kings. Family Guy's Three Kings episode represents the show's attempt at literary parody, with Peter Griffin retelling 3 Stephen King adaptations through the series' characteristic crude humor and pop culture references. The episode combines Stand By Me, Misery, and The Shawshank Redemption into a single anthology format while inserting inappropriate sexual content, racial stereotypes, and violence into beloved coming-of-age and redemption narratives. The episode begins with Peter defending his television consumption by claiming he's been reading Stephen King, whom he declares the greatest author in the last 1,000 years. This hyperbolic praise immediately establishes Peter's lack of literary perspective while setting up his role as an unreliable narrator who will filter these stories through his own crude worldview. His framing device positions television watching as equivalent to reading, suggesting that consuming adaptations equals experiencing original literature. The Stand By Me segment opens with Richard Dreyfuss narrating Peter's version of the classic coming-of-age story, but quickly devolves into inappropriate content that fundamentally misunderstands the original's themes. The episode transforms Quagmire's character into someone who had sex when he was 5 and committed his first rape when he was 10, casually adding that rape was legal in the 50 seconds. This disturbing addition serves no comedic purpose beyond shock value, while trivializing sexual violence through false historical claims. The racial content becomes particularly problematic when Cleveland's character enters in a stereotypical black man manner, after Peter demands he re-enter the clubhouse in a more stereotypically animated fashion. Cleveland then speaks in exaggerated dialect, saying, "Lord Almighty, I done seen me a dead body down by the lake." This forced stereotyping reduces a human character to racist caricature, while treating historical discrimination as comedic material. The episode's treatment of disability appears repeatedly through characters losing their legs in various accidents. Joey gets run over by not one but 2 trains in rapid succession, leading to him screaming, "What an odd, clustered train schedule." This pattern continues throughout all 3 segments, with the sheriff in Misery and Boggs in Shawshank also losing their legs. The repetitive nature suggests the writers found leg amputation inherently funny rather than recognizing it as a serious injury affecting real people. The Misery segment features Stewie as Annie Wilkes, holding Paul Sheldon captive over a children's book series called Snuggly Jeff. While this setup could provide commentary on toxic fandom, the episode instead focuses on Stewie's admission that he fondled the unconscious Paul, stating, "Not anymore," when Paul asks if he's wearing lipstick. This sexual assault gets treated as a throwaway joke, rather than addressing the serious violation it represents. Stewie's critique of storytelling through his Contact rant demonstrates the episode's occasional moments of genuine media criticism, but these insights get buried beneath crude humor and violence. His complaint about the movie's plot holes shows understanding of narrative structure, yet the episode immediately returns to inappropriate content rather than developing these themes meaningfully. The Shawshank Redemption parody reduces one of cinema's most acclaimed prison dramas to scatological humor and superficial observations about race relations. Andy's friendship with Red becomes explicitly about their racial difference, with Andy declaring, "Since you're black and I'm white, that makes it more especial for the audience." This heavy-handed commentary on Hollywood's treatment of interracial friendships lacks the subtlety needed to make meaningful points about representation. The segments focus on Andy carving Star Wars figurines instead of pursuing education or legal work, eliminates the original story's themes of intellectual growth and systematic corruption. Instead of using his banking skills to expose the warden's money laundering, Peter's version has Andy selling collectibles while the warden remains generically corrupt without specific crimes or consequences. The musical sequence featuring Gwen Stefani's Hollaback Girl playing over the prison PA system provides the episode's most dated element, with Red's narration calling it a foul, disease-ridden thing performed by a 4-7-year-old fish dog. This gratuitous attack on a real person serves no narrative purpose, while revealing the writer's willingness to insult actual celebrities for cheap laughs. The escape sequence reduces Andy's careful planning and symbolic rebirth to crude bathroom humor, with Red noting that Andy chose enchilada night for his crawl through the sewage pipe. This scatological focus eliminates the original's themes of perseverance and transformation, replacing meaningful symbolism with toilet humor that adds nothing to the story. The anthology format allows Family Guy to demonstrate its shallow engagement with source material across multiple properties simultaneously. Rather than exploring why these stories endure or what makes Stephen King's work compelling, the episode simply uses recognizable plots as frameworks for the show's standard inappropriate humor and pop culture references. The episode's treatment of mental health through Stewie's obsessive behavior in Misery receives no serious examination, instead being played entirely for laughs. His violent threats and sexual assault of an unconscious person get treated as typical Stewie antics, rather than recognizing these as serious criminal behaviors requiring intervention. Most problematically, the episode's racial content perpetuates harmful stereotypes while claiming to address them. The Stand By Me segment's forced dialect and the Shawshank segment's explicit commentary on interracial friendship both handle race relations clumsily using awareness of stereotypes as justification for perpetuating them rather than challenging underlying assumptions. The anthology's conclusion returns to Peter's original justification for watching television instead of reading, with his threat that, "We'll see you in court," directed at Stephen King, suggesting awareness that the parodies might constitute copyright infringement. This self-aware joke acknowledges the derivative nature of the content while claiming legal protection through parody fair use. Three Kings ultimately demonstrates how crude humor can undermine meaningful source material by prioritizing shock value over genuine commentary or tribute. The episode shows familiarity with beloved stories but uses that knowledge primarily to subvert expectations through inappropriate content, rather than exploring what makes these narratives culturally significant. Three Kings presents Peter Griffin's crude retellings of three Stephen King adaptations, Stand By Me, Misery, and The Shawshank Redemption, filled with sexual, assault jokes, racial stereotypes, and repetitive disability humor. The episode features Quagmire as a child rapist in the 1,950 seconds, Stewie sexually assaulting an unconscious writer, and multiple characters losing their legs in various accidents, while reducing classic coming-of-age and redemption stories to scatological humor and pop culture references that prioritize shock value over meaningful literary commentary. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Peter Caviar Eater. The episode combines crude humor with commentary on American class distinctions while showcasing Peter Griffin's complete inability to adapt to refined social environments, ultimately reinforcing stereotypes about both working class and upper class behavior. The episode begins with Peter's violent reaction to spending a week with wealthy relatives, immediately establishing his hostility toward upper class social expectations. His prayer asking God to kill me now, followed by a stream of profanity, demonstrates how Peter views politeness and social refinement as personal torture rather than basic courtesy. This opening sets up the central conflict between Peter's crude authenticity and society's behavioral expectations. Brian's attempt to teach Peter gentlemanly conversation reveals the depth of Peter's social dysfunction. When asked to practice polite small talk, Peter responds with graphic details about Bob Crane's murder, showing how his mind immediately gravitates toward inappropriate topics. His proud delivery of these disturbing facts demonstrates his complete misunderstanding of social boundaries and his belief that sharing shocking information constitutes interesting conversation. The inheritance of Cherrywood Manor transforms the Griffin family's economic status overnight, allowing the episode to explore how sudden wealth affects different family members. Stewie immediately adapts to aristocratic behavior by commanding servants to cut my milk and threatening diaper duty punishment, revealing his natural authoritarian tendencies. His demand that servants freeze milk before cutting it shows how power corrupts through increasingly absurd expectations that servants must fulfill regardless of logic. Meg's response to wealth involves explicit gold-digging aspirations, declaring she's gonna bag me a rich one at Newport High School. Her mercenary approach to relationships contrasts sharply with Lois's romantic idealism, creating generational tension about marriage motivations. Meg's criticism of Quohog as that one-horse town demonstrates how quickly she abandons her working-class roots when presented with better options. Peter's dinner party story about the Mexican rat reveals multiple layers of inappropriate behavior that the wealthy guests tolerate only because of his newfound economic status. His insistence on sharing an urban legend as fact, combined with racist language describing a big, stinkin' Mexican rat, shows how wealth cannot purchase social awareness or cultural sensitivity. The story's expansion, with each telling, demonstrates Peter's relationship with truth as flexible rather than factual. The episode's treatment of servants and working-class characters reinforces problematic power dynamics through comedy rather than challenging them. Stewie's threats toward domestic staff and Peter's casual dismissal of yacht club rules demonstrate how inherited wealth creates entitlement without responsibility. The servant's patient tolerance of absurd demands like cutting liquid milk reflects real-world service industry dynamics, where workers must accommodate wealthy clients' irrational requests. Lois's position as the family's cultural bridge becomes increasingly strained as Peter's behavior escalates. Her attempts to moderate his stories and explain his actions reveal her embarrassment at his inability to code switch between social environments. However, Her ultimate defense of Peter suggests that love transcends class boundaries, though the episode undercuts this romantic notion through Peter's final crude revelation about her family history. The mansion's history as America's first presidential whorehouse provides Peter with ammunition for his most offensive behavior toward the established wealthy families. His claims about Lincoln having jungle fever combine historical figures with racist language while asserting his home's superior historical significance. These fabricated stories demonstrate how Peter uses false historical narratives to justify his presence among established wealth. The episode's portrayal of upper-class society relies heavily on stereotypes about refined behavior and cultural pretension. The wealthy characters speak in affected tones while engaging in activities like baccarat and yacht sailing, presenting aristocratic culture as performative rather than substantive. However, the episode fails to critique these behaviors meaningfully, instead using them as targets for Peter's crude disruption. Chris and Meg's different adaptations to wealth reveal how class mobility affects young people's identity formation. Chris embraces the power to poke poor people with a stick, showing how quickly privilege creates contempt for former peers. Meg's focus on romantic conquest through economic advantage demonstrates how wealth becomes a tool for social advancement rather than personal fulfillment. Both children abandon working-class solidarity immediately when presented with better options. The Cosby Show parody featuring Dr. Huxtable's head falling off while ignoring serious family problems serves as commentary on how media presents idealized family dynamics while avoiding real issues. The surreal imagery of the spinning head disconnect from reality mirrors how wealthy families often maintain facades while ignoring underlying dysfunction. This sequence suggests that all family structures, regardless of economic status, contain elements of performance and denial. Peter's final lesson about family ancestry being pimps and whores reveals the episode's cynical view of American class distinctions. Rather than learning respect for his wife's feelings or the value of social courtesy, Peter concludes that all wealthy families built their fortunes through morally questionable means. This revelation provides him with justification for his behavior while suggesting that class differences are superficial rather than substantive. The episode's resolution returns the Griffin family to their working-class status in Quohog, but the experience has changed their perspectives on wealth and social mobility. Meg's disappointment at leaving Newport and Chris's nostalgic violence toward poor people suggest that brief exposure to privilege creates lasting resentment toward their original economic position. The family's return to normalcy carries undertones of class consciousness that cannot be easily forgotten. Most problematically, the episode uses racist language and stereotypes as comedic elements without challenging the underlying prejudices they represent. Peter's casual use of terms like jungle fever and his rat story's ethnic implications treat racism as character quirks rather than serious social issues. This approach normalizes discriminatory language while suggesting that crude honesty is preferable to polite social conventions. The mansion setting allows the episode to explore American attitudes toward inherited wealth versus earned success, but it ultimately reinforces existing class hierarchies rather than questioning them. Peter's inability to adapt becomes a celebration of working-class authenticity, while the wealthy characters remain largely undeveloped stereotypes. This structure prevents meaningful examination of how economic inequality affects both groups. Peter, Caviar Eater, demonstrates Family Guy's tendency to use social issues as comedy frameworks without engaging seriously with their implications. The episode presents class conflict as primarily cultural rather than economic, focusing on behavioral differences while ignoring structural inequalities that create and maintain wealth disparities. Peter, Caviar Eater follows the Griffin family's temporary wealth after inheriting Aunt Marguerite's mansion, featuring Peter's inability to adapt to high society through crude dinner stories about Mexican rats, racist comments about Lincoln having jungle fever, and Stewie's authoritarian demands that servants cut my milk. The episode explores class differences through Peter's social dysfunction and the children's quick adaptation to privilege, ultimately revealing that Lois's wealthy ancestors were pimps and whores, while using racist language and stereotypes as comedy without meaningful social commentary. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have To Love and Die in Dixie. Family Guy's To Love and Die in Dixie episode follows the Griffin family entering witness protection in the Deep South after Chris witnesses a convenience store robbery, leading to their relocation to a rural community where they struggle with cultural differences. The episode combines fish-out-of-water comedy with disturbing elements, including Herbert, the pervert's obsessive messages about Chris, and crude regional stereotypes that rely on offensive assumptions about Southern culture. The episode begins with Chris seeking romantic advice from Meg about gift-giving, prompting her elaborate fantasy about dating Prince William, complete with watches, tiaras, and scepters. Her delusional claims, followed by maniacal laughter, reveal her desperate need for romantic validation, leading Stewie to crudely observe that she needs to get laid, big time. This opening establishes the family's various romantic dysfunctions while treating teenage sexual frustration as comedic material. Peter's advice about women being from Venus leads to his literal interpretation involving thick layers of sulfuric acid, viscous surface rock, and coronae, which seem to be collapsed domes over large magma chambers. This absurd scientific description demonstrates Peter's inability to understand metaphorical language while showcasing his tendency to overthink simple concepts through completely irrelevant technical details. Chris's gift of perfume to Barbara includes the disturbing description that it'll make you smell like Elizabeth Taylor, so you'll smell like bourbon and Vicodin. This joke treats addiction and prescription drug abuse as punchline material while targeting a real person's struggles with substance dependency. The casual reference to alcohol and pills as defining characteristics reduces a complex human being to her most publicized problems. The episode's most concerning element appears through Herbert's answering machine messages, which reveal his predatory obsession with Chris as the newspaper delivery boy. Herbert's calls progress from seemingly innocent inquiries about newspaper delivery to explicitly threatening language, including calling Chris a pigly sunbitch and demanding he call me. These messages demonstrate escalating stalker behavior that would constitute criminal harassment in real situations. Herbert's references to the muscly arm paperboy and his desire for Chris to come by and bring me some good news contain obvious sexual undertones that treat predatory behavior toward minors as comedic material. The progression from loneliness to anger in his messages follows patterns typical of actual predators, making these scenes particularly disturbing given Chris's status as a minor character. The witness protection premise stems from Chris witnessing a criminal who explicitly threatens to kill Chris Griffin after serving jail time. This threat gets overshadowed by Herbert's concurrent harassment, creating a situation where multiple adult men pose dangers to the same child character. The episode treats both threats as comedy rather than recognizing the serious implications of adults targeting minors. The family's relocation to the Deep South introduces problematic regional stereotypes through characters like the hillbilly, who tells Lois she smells like the inside of my mama's purse. These portrayals reduce Southern culture to crude caricatures while reinforcing urban prejudices about rural communities. The episode perpetuates harmful stereotypes without offering meaningful commentary on regional differences or cultural understanding. Peter's job interview cutaway reveals his sexual fixation on inappropriate workplace behavior when he thinks, "Don't say doing your wife," repeatedly before blurting out, "doing your son." This scene treats sexual harassment as inevitable male behavior, while suggesting that Peter's crude thinking represents typical masculine psychology rather than specific character dysfunction. The family's financial struggles become apparent through their deteriorated house and overwhelming debt, with Lois optimistically suggesting they could fix their home to make it a piece of crap. This economic hardship provides context for their witness protection situation while highlighting how financial desperation affects family dynamics and decision-making processes. The episode's treatment of violence appears through the criminal's casual threat against Chris, combined with Peter's Dukes of Hazzard reference, where he wants Meg to be boss hog and Chris can be anus. Peter's mispronunciation of Enos as anus demonstrates his crude mindset, while incorporating his children into violent fantasies involving car chases and criminal behavior. The answering machine sequence with 113 messages primarily from Herbert creates an escalating sense of harassment that the episode presents as humorous rather than threatening. Herbert's progression from polite inquiry to angry demands mirrors real-world stalking patterns, yet the show treats this behavior as comedic eccentricity rather than criminal conduct requiring intervention. The episode's exploration of witness protection fails to address the serious psychological impact of forced relocation on family members, particularly children who must abandon their established social connections and educational continuity. Instead, the focus remains on superficial cultural differences and crude humor, rather than examining how such disruptions affect family stability. Most problematically, the episode normalizes predatory behavior through Herbert's character, while simultaneously placing Chris in vulnerable situations with multiple adult threats. The combination of witness protection, isolation, and predatory stalking creates circumstances that would require immediate law enforcement intervention in reality, yet the show presents these elements as ongoing comedy rather than serious safety concerns. The regional humor relies heavily on stereotypes about Southern intelligence, hygiene, and social customs, without offering counterbalancing perspectives or acknowledging the diversity within Southern communities. This approach perpetuates harmful generalizations while positioning the Griffin family as culturally superior, despite their obvious dysfunction. To Love and Die in Dixie demonstrates Family Guy's willingness to use child endangerment scenarios as comedy frameworks while trivializing serious issues like stalking, harassment, and regional prejudice. The episode's treatment of Herbert's behavior particularly crosses ethical boundaries by presenting predatory conduct toward minors as harmless eccentricity, rather than recognizing it as criminal behavior requiring intervention. To Love and Die in Dixie follows the Griffin family entering witness protection in the South after Chris witnesses a crime, featuring Herbert leaving increasingly disturbing answering machine messages about wanting to see the muscly arm paperboy and calling Chris a pigly son bitch. While the episode relies on crude Southern stereotypes and treats, Chris's gift advice that perfume will make his girlfriend smell like bourbon and Vicodin as humor, ultimately normalizing predatory stalking behavior toward a minor character. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Rhode Island. Family Guy's Rhode to Rhode Island episode follows Stewie and Brian's cross-country journey home after being stranded at a motel, while Peter purchases expensive relationship advice tapes in a misguided attempt to improve his marriage to Lois. The episode combines road trip comedy with themes of alcoholism, financial irresponsibility, and the complex dynamics between different family members forced into close quarters during stressful circumstances. The episode begins with Peter's obsession with relationship improvement tapes, despite their escalating costs and Lois's obvious skepticism about their value. His willingness to spend $49.95 on advice while the family faces financial constraints demonstrates his inability to prioritize practical concerns over quick-fix solutions. Peter's verbal slip, combining nipples and dimes with nickels and boobs, reveals how his crude mindset infiltrates even attempts at romantic gestures. Stewie and Brian's situation at the motel showcases their contrasting personalities under stress, with Stewie maintaining his articulate sophistication while Brian struggles with obvious alcohol dependency. Brian's claim of having a speech impediment, followed immediately by vomiting and falling off a stool, demonstrates the classic denial patterns associated with addiction. His attempts to rationalize his condition while displaying clear symptoms of intoxication reflect real-world alcoholism behaviors. The motel manager's threat, involving a blunt instrument that's more of an object, but kind of like a bat, provides comic relief through his uncertain description of his weapon. This rambling explanation contrasts with the actual threat he represents, showing how even minor authority figures can become menacing when people lack resources or legal protection. Stewie's attempts to contact family using systematic phone number, dialing 111 to 1000, 111, 111 to 1000, 112, 111 to 1000, 113, demonstrates his logical problem-solving approach, while revealing his limited understanding of actual phone systems. His reference to Tommy Two-Tone's 867 to 5309 shows how pop culture references infiltrate even crisis situations, while his methodical approach to the problem reveals his analytical personality traits. The episode's treatment of Chris and Meg's relationship appears through their word-guessing game, where Chris becomes frustrated that Meg repeatedly guesses Kitty, regardless of the actual answer. This dynamic reflects their broader sibling relationship, where communication breaks down through repetitive patterns and mutual misunderstanding. Chris's dramatic plea to "get out of my head" suggests deeper psychological frustration with family relationships. Brian's drunk driving with Stewie creates genuinely dangerous situations that the episode treats as comedy rather than recognizing the serious safety implications. When Brian deliberately slams the brakes to launch Stewie into the windshield after being criticized, he commits assault against a child character while operating a vehicle under the influence. This sequence normalizes drunk driving and violence against minors through supposed humor. The various encounters during their road trip include inappropriate sexual content when a stranger asks if Stewie is traveling alone, prompting Stewie's response about the man's braces. These interactions highlight how child characters face real dangers from adults, yet the episode treats these situations as opportunities for witty comebacks, rather than recognizing the genuine threats they represent. Peter's relationship with an unnamed woman creates marital conflict when Lois discovers them together, leading to Peter's classic denial that "she means nothing to me." This scene reinforces patterns of infidelity and dishonesty within the Griffin marriage, while treating adultery as typical male behavior rather than serious relationship betrayal requiring accountability. The episode's resolution involves Stewie referencing the Brady Bunch episode where Bobby becomes Greg's slave after saving his life, demanding that Brian tape the show with a nice label on it. This reference to 1,970 seconds family television contrasts sharply with the crude content of Family Guy itself, highlighting how contemporary comedy has abandoned wholesome family dynamics in favor of dysfunction and inappropriate behavior. Throughout their journey, Stewie maintains his sophisticated vocabulary and cultural references, despite being a toddler character, creating cognitive dissonance between his apparent age and intellectual capacity. His complaints about his Huggies being holed up in Box Canyon combines infantile needs with military terminology, reflecting the character's unusual combination of baby and adult characteristics. The episode's treatment of alcoholism through Brian's character fails to address the serious health and safety implications of his drinking problem. Instead of showing consequences or recovery attempts, the show treats his addiction as a personality quirk that occasionally creates comedic situations. This approach trivializes alcohol dependency while normalizing dangerous behaviors like drunk driving. Most concerning is how the episode treats child endangerment situations as comedy rather than recognizing the serious safety issues involved. Stewie faces multiple threats from adults, experiences physical violence from Brian, and witnesses criminal activity, yet none of these experiences receive appropriate adult intervention or protection. The episode suggests that children can handle adult situations independently rather than acknowledging their need for safety and supervision. The road trip format allows the episode to explore themes of forced intimacy between unlikely companions, but it uses this premise primarily for crude humor rather than meaningful character development. While Stewie and Brian do bond through shared adversity, their relationship dynamic remains fundamentally inappropriate, given the age difference and Brian's addiction issues. Rhode to Rhode Island follows Stewie and Brian's cross-country journey home from a motel while Peter buys expensive relationship tapes featuring Brian's obvious alcoholism denial when he claims to have a speech impediment before vomiting and falling down, Stewie systematically dialing phone numbers starting with 111 to 1,111, and Brian deliberately slamming the brakes to launch Stewie into the windshield during drunk driving, ultimately treating child endangerment and alcohol addiction as comedy, while normalizing dangerous behaviors through supposed humor. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Rhode to Germany. Family Guy's Rhode to Germany episode follows Stewie and Brian's accidental time travel to Nazi-occupied Europe with Mort Goldman, combining science fiction elements with World War II settings, while trivializing the Holocaust through crude humor and inappropriate comedic situations. The episode represents one of the show's most controversial attempts at historical comedy, treating genocide and wartime atrocities as material for jokes, rather than acknowledging the gravity of these events. The episode begins with Stewie's confusion over a European See-and-Say toy that produces nonsensical animal sounds like wank for pigs and shazoo for cows. This opening establishes the episode's theme of cultural miscommunication while providing Stewie with a method for identifying their location once transported to wartime Europe. The toy's incorrect animal sounds serve as both comedy and plot device when they encounter actual European cows making shazoo sounds. Mort Goldman's character transformation from his usual mild-mannered persona to an aggressively profane individual creates jarring tonal shifts throughout the episode. His outburst containing multiple uses of fuck and shit while describing his situation as a Jew in Nazi-occupied Europe reflects genuine terror about his circumstances, yet the episode treats his panic as comedic, rather than acknowledging the legitimate historical fears he would face. The time traveler's disguise as German officers leads to problematic scenarios where main characters wear Nazi uniforms while infiltrating military facilities. Stewie's discovery of a McCain-Palin campaign button on his stolen uniform provides contemporary political commentary, but also suggests equivalencies between modern American politics and Nazi ideology that trivialize both historical fascism and current political discourse. Stewie's impersonation of Hitler includes him coloring his hair and drawing a mustache to fool Nazi scientists, who accept his disguise despite obvious flaws in his appearance and accent. His greeting to the scientists with "It's a dog-eat-dog Reich and I'm wearing bacon pants" combines historical terminology with nonsensical humor, treating Hitler's persona as material for wordplay rather than recognizing the horrific reality of his actions. The episode's treatment of Holocaust themes becomes particularly concerning when Mort describes potential Nazi torture involving beating him unmerciful and rubbing dirt in my ass neck and all over my assy nipples. This crude sexual imagery trivializes actual Holocaust torture methods while reducing historical atrocities to scatological humor. Mort's invented terminology, ass neck, assy nipples, treats anti-Semitic violence as fodder for juvenile body part jokes. Brian's political commentary about America's reluctance to intervene in Germany because they don't have any oil provides critique of contemporary foreign policy decisions, but this modern perspective feels anachronistic when applied to 1,940 seconds geopolitics. The joke treats complex historical decisions about military intervention as simple economic calculations, while ignoring the actual strategic and humanitarian considerations of the era. The submarine theft sequence includes German dialogue describing their vessel being stolen by a dog, a baby, and Art Garfunkel, with the Art Garfunkel reference treating Mort's appearance as interchangeable with a famous Jewish entertainer. This comparison reduces Jewish identity to physical stereotypes while making Holocaust victims the subject of celebrity resemblance jokes. Stewie's attempt to join the British Royal Air Force involves listing stereotypical British characteristics, including poor dental hygiene, possible homosexuality, and having a ghastly wife. These crude generalizations treat national identity as collections of offensive stereotypes while reducing complex cultural differences to simple caricatures that reinforce, rather than challenge, prejudiced thinking. The episode's climax features Hitler offering to spare the protagonists' lives if they perform a charming musical number, leading to the beginning of a song and dance routine that gets interrupted by Mort's profanity-laden demand to use the time machine. This sequence treats Hitler as an entertainment-focused character rather than acknowledging his role in systematic genocide, reducing historical evil to musical comedy tropes. Throughout their adventure, the characters witness weapons development and military operations, but treat these serious wartime activities as backdrop for their personal conflicts and crude humor. The episode fails to acknowledge how their presence in this historical period could affect actual events or recognize the gravity of the circumstances surrounding them. The time machine malfunction that strands them in Nazi Europe creates genuine tension about their survival, particularly for Mort as a Jewish character in extreme danger. However, the episode treats this peril primarily as setup for crude jokes, rather than exploring the psychological impact of facing potential genocide or the historical reality of Jewish persecution during this period. Most problematically, the episode uses the Holocaust as a comedy setting without providing meaningful commentary about prejudice, genocide, or historical lessons. Instead of using humor to illuminate important truths about this dark period, the show simply extracts comedic situations from tragic circumstances while treating historical atrocities as interchangeable with fictional conflicts. The episode's resolution returns the characters to their contemporary setting without lasting consequences or reflection on their historical experience. None of the protagonists express changed perspectives about war, prejudice, or historical responsibility after witnessing Nazi Germany firsthand, suggesting that historical experiences serve only as temporary adventure settings rather than opportunities for character growth or moral development. Rhode to Germany follows Stewie and Brian accidentally traveling to Nazi-occupied Europe with Mort Goldman, featuring Mort's profane outbursts about being a Jew in Nazi-occupied Europe, with crude references to torture involving his ass neck and assy nipples, Stewie impersonating Hitler with marker-drawn hair and mustache, and Hitler offering to spare their lives for a charming musical number, ultimately trivializing the Holocaust through crude humor while treating genocide and wartime atrocities as comedy material rather than acknowledging historical gravity. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to North by North Quohog. Family Guy's North by North Quohog episode presents a meta-commentary on the show's own cancellation while following Peter Griffin's theft of Mel Gibson's film The Passion of the Christ in an attempt to prevent its release. The episode combines self-aware television industry humor with celebrity impersonation and political satire, while featuring problematic content including substance abuse among minors and crude sexual humor involving historical figures. The episode opens with Peter announcing the show's cancellation and listing numerous Fox programs that supposedly took their time slot, including Dark Angel, Titus, Firefly, and many other short-lived series. This extensive list serves as both explanation for the real-world cancellation and criticism of Fox's programming decisions, with Peter suggesting hope for renewal if all those shows go down the tubes. The meta-commentary acknowledges the show's precarious network position while positioning Family Guy as superior to its replacements. Peter's motivation to steal Gibson's film stems from his declaration that he must save the world another 2 hours of torture and protect Jesus and Snoopy and all the other beloved children's characters. This bizarre comparison between religious figures and cartoon characters demonstrates Peter's inability to distinguish between sacred and secular cultural icons, while his characterization of the film as torture reveals his shallow engagement with serious religious themes. The episode's treatment of underage drinking appears when Chris faces peer pressure to consume vodka stolen from a parent's liquor cabinet. The scene initially presents realistic teenage alcohol experimentation, but then transitions into a parody of G.I. Joe public service announcements, with Flint providing statistics about alcohol-related deaths. This tonal shift from serious substance abuse issues to nostalgic cartoon references undermines the educational message while treating teenage drinking as primarily comedic. Stewie's fantasy about owning land includes him relaxing with a cocktail while declaring, "It's good to have land," presenting alcohol consumption as a symbol of sophisticated adult success. This portrayal contrasts sharply with the Chris drinking scene, suggesting that alcohol represents either teenage rebellion or aristocratic leisure, depending on the character and context, without consistent messaging about substance use. The sexual content involving Mount Rushmore presidents watching Peter and Lois engage in intimate activities reduces historical figures to voyeuristic participants in crude humor. Washington's comment about a chick getting nailed on my head, followed by Jefferson's sweet response, treats national monuments and founding fathers as fraternal observers of sexual activity, trivializing both historical reverence and intimate relationships. Peter's impersonation of Mel Gibson relies on claiming weight gain for a role as Peter Griffin, a heroic warrior who defied the English to free England from the English. This nonsensical description parodies Gibson's Braveheart, while creating circular logic about English liberation that reveals Peter's complete misunderstanding of historical conflicts. His successful deception of hotel staff suggests that celebrity impersonation requires only minimal effort and confidence. The political satire reaches controversial territory when Peter addresses Congress about Iraq war justification, declaring that anyone that doesn't want to go to war is gay. This crude reduction of complex geopolitical decisions to homophobic peer pressure presents war support as driven by masculine insecurity rather than strategic considerations. The subsequent congressional agreement and Dick Cheney's competitive response, "I was the first one who wanted to go to war," satirize political decision-making as childish competition. Chris's philosophical observation about mining for nose gold and sharing with townspeople demonstrates the episode's tendency to present profound-sounding statements about meaningless activities. This pseudo-wisdom parodies both coming-of-age narratives and frontier mythology, while reducing personal growth to discovering that sharing bodily functions creates community bonds. The British parody featuring polite commentary, almost, there we are, well done, treats cultural stereotypes about British reserve as comedic material while sexualizing national identity. This sequence perpetuates assumptions about British sexual behavior while reducing international differences to accent-based humor rather than meaningful cultural understanding. Brian and Stewie's power dynamic appears when Stewie demands diaper changing while asking, "Does it smell like servitude?" This scene treats caregiver relationships as master-slave dynamics while sexualizing childcare through domination language. The inappropriate power reversal between adult dog and infant human creates uncomfortable implications about dependency and control within family structures. The episode's treatment of religious themes through Peter's characterization of the Passion of the Christ as torture entertainment reveals shallow engagement with spiritual content, rather than addressing the film's controversial depiction of religious events or its cultural impact. The episode treats faith-based cinema as inherently problematic without examining why religious stories matter to believers. Most concerning is how the episode normalizes celebrity stalking and theft through Peter's hotel infiltration and film robbery. His successful impersonation and theft get treated as clever schemes rather than criminal behavior, suggesting that famous people deserve invasion of privacy and property theft if their work offends someone's sensibilities. North by North Quohog combines meta-commentary about Family Guy's cancellation with Peter stealing Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ film, featuring Mount Rushmore presidents voyeuristically watching Peter and Lois have sex while making crude comments, Chris facing peer pressure to drink stolen vodka before a G.I. Joe PSA intervention, and Peter convincing Congress to support the Iraq War by declaring anyone that doesn't want to go to war is gay, while treating celebrity impersonation, theft, and political manipulation as comedic rather than criminal behavior. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Let's Go to the Hop. Family Guy's Let's Go to the Hop episode follows Peter Griffin's attempt to infiltrate his old high school to relive his teenage years, leading to inappropriate romantic situations with actual minors and problematic commentary on drug education. The episode combines nostalgia themes with disturbing age gap relationships while treating Peter's delusional behavior and predatory actions as comedic rather than recognizing the serious legal and ethical violations involved. The episode begins with news coverage of toad-licking drug trends, with Tom Tucker providing euphemisms like lily padding and Frenching the Prince. This opening establishes the show's approach to drug education through crude humor, while setting up Peter's misguided intervention in teenage substance abuse. The terminology parodies media sensationalism around youth drug trends, while reducing serious addiction issues to amphibian-based wordplay. Peter's own drug experience gets depicted through a meta-fictional sequence where he enters the real world and panics about the transition from animated to live-action reality. His description of drugs making things got way too real treats substance abuse as primarily about altered perception rather than addressing addiction, health consequences, or psychological impacts. This portrayal trivializes drug experiences while avoiding meaningful discussion of substance abuse prevention. The age gap relationship between Peter and high school student Connie D'Amico creates the episode's most disturbing content, with Peter claiming to be 17 and a half while clearly being a middle-aged adult pursuing a teenage girl. His comment about sweet statutory directly references statutory rape laws while treating potential sexual crimes against minors as comedic wordplay. The episode presents this relationship as romantic rather than predatory. Peter's interaction with Connie's parents includes his admission that he has a daughter of my own while simultaneously dating their teenage daughter, creating obvious parallels that the episode fails to address. His declaration that he'll take good care of your kid takes on sinister implications given the age difference and his deceptive identity claims. The parents' discomfort gets played for awkward humor rather than appropriate concern. The Breakfast Club parody featuring cereal mascots allows Peter to interact with corporate characters in inappropriate contexts, with Tony the Tiger delivering profanity-laden dialogue about cigarette addiction and family dysfunction. This sequence treats children's advertising icons as participants in adult dysfunction while combining nostalgia for 1,980 seconds cinema with crude humor about substance abuse and domestic problems. Stewie's treatment of Lois during the banana pudding scene demonstrates escalating verbal abuse patterns, calling her cooking wretched culinary abortions and demanding she clean it up after he deliberately destroys the food. His sophisticated vocabulary masks controlling behavior toward his mother, normalizing domestic abuse through the character's supposed intellectual superiority and infantile status. The episode's portrayal of high school social dynamics includes a teacher declaring a female student a witch for answering math problems correctly, while Mr. Burler explicitly tells Meg she's not part of the popular clique and should play alone somewhere. These scenes treat educational discrimination and social exclusion as normal school experiences, rather than recognizing them as harmful behaviors requiring intervention. Peter's romantic history gets revealed when he admits having such a crush on Connie before meeting Lois, calling Lois his silver medal. This comparison reduces his wife to a consolation prize, while suggesting his current marriage represents settling for less than his teenage fantasies. The episode treats marital relationships as competitive rankings rather than meaningful partnerships. The drug education subplot fails to provide accurate information about substance abuse while focusing on sensationalized terminology and comedic situations. Rather than addressing real teenage drug problems or effective prevention strategies, the episode uses substance abuse as setup for Peter's inappropriate school infiltration and romantic pursuit of minors. Most concerning is Peter's justification for dating Connie through his haba 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 haba, okay? response, treating teenage attraction as uncontrollable impulse rather than recognizing adult responsibility to maintain appropriate boundaries with minors. His excitement about being asked to the dance by the hottest girl in school ignores the predatory nature of his deception and pursuit. The episode's resolution suggests Peter successfully maintains his false identity throughout the school experience without facing consequences for fraud, identity theft, or inappropriate relationships with minors. This outcome normalizes deceptive behavior while failing to address the legal and ethical violations involved in adult infiltration of educational institutions. The social commentary about school safety through Peter's observation that high school is safer now that all the kids have guns treats armed students as positive development rather than recognizing weapons in schools as serious safety concerns. This casual reference to school violence reflects the episode's tendency to treat serious issues as throwaway jokes. Let's Go to the Hop features Peter Griffin infiltrating high school by claiming to be 17 while pursuing teenage student Connie D'Amico, making sweet statutory rape references, and telling her parents he'll take good care of your kid, despite being a middle-aged adult with his own daughter. While the episode treats this predatory deception as romantic comedy and includes Stewie verbally abusing Lois by calling her cooking wretched culinary abortions, ultimately normalizing adult-minor romantic relationships and educational fraud without consequences. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to The Simpsons Guy. Family Guy's The Simpsons Guy episode represents the show's most ambitious crossover project, featuring the Griffin family's encounter with the Simpsons characters after fleeing Quohog due to controversy over Peter's offensive comic strip. The episode combines meta-commentary about television crossovers with problematic content including sexist humor, inappropriate sexual references involving minors, and extensive crude behavior that treats serious issues as comedy material. The episode begins with Peter's criticism of Dennis the Menace comics for showing the character just shoveling snow and being helpful, leading him to declare, "We might as well just call it Dennis now. He's not a menace." This opening establishes Peter's shallow understanding of entertainment while setting up his misguided attempt to create superior comic content. His belief that he can do better than these idiots reveals his typical overconfidence in areas where he lacks expertise. Peter's comic strip For Pete's Sake consists of crude jokes, including a man on an island asking a monkey, "Are you free tonight?" and a banana responding to questions about his wife with, "Not good, she's a vegetable." These simplistic puns demonstrate Peter's juvenile sense of humor, while Brian's praise for Peter's detached, ironic approach to tired old gags provides commentary on how low-effort content gets intellectualized through critical interpretation. The episode's most disturbing element emerges through Peter's sexist comic, showing a man throwing a woman onto a counter while yelling, "My dishwasher broke," to a cashier. This image treats domestic violence and gender discrimination as punchline material, reducing women to household appliances while normalizing aggressive behavior toward female partners. Peter's explanation that his wife washed dishes for him demonstrates his inability to recognize the harmful implications of his humor. The escalation to a vacuum cleaner joke where the cashier says, "I remember you from yesterday," suggests repeated visits by the same abusive customer, creating a pattern of violence that the episode treats as comedic rather than recognizing it as depicting serial domestic abuse. These comics cross ethical boundaries by making light of genuine threats women face in abusive relationships. Peter's television appearance on The Flow reveals his complete disconnect from the impact of his content when he tells the female host, "You sound angry. Did one of your friends get engaged?" This response treats women's legitimate concerns about sexism as jealousy over relationship status, demonstrating how he dismisses criticism by attributing it to personal inadequacies rather than recognizing valid objections to harmful content. His boast about knowing more porn stars than the host, while admitting he knows all of them, including people who just started an hour ago, reveals his extensive consumption of pornographic material, while treating this knowledge as something to be proud of, rather than recognizing it as inappropriate to discuss on television. This admission also suggests obsessive monitoring of adult entertainment industry personnel. The family's flight from Quohog occurs after angry women surround their house, throwing bricks while chanting slogans about sexism and misogyny. Peter's response to the first brick as, "That brick I ordered," followed by confusion about the second one, demonstrates his inability to connect his actions with their consequences, treating violent retaliation as coincidental rather than reactive to his offensive behavior. The crossover premise begins when the Griffin family's car gets stolen at a gas station, stranding them in Springfield, where they encounter the Simpsons characters. This setup allows for extensive character comparisons between the two animated families, while providing opportunities for crude humor and inappropriate interactions between characters from different franchises. Stewie's relationship with Bart Simpson creates concerning dynamics when Stewie attempts to impress his new friend through increasingly extreme behavior, including kidnapping and torturing Bart's school bully Nelson. The torture sequence features Stewie using jumper cables, dental tools, and psychological intimidation while forcing Nelson to eat my shorts, literally, treating child-on-child violence as comedic rather than recognizing it as serious criminal behavior. Meg's interaction with Lisa Simpson provides one of the episode's few positive elements when Lisa encourages Meg's saxophone playing and tells her, "You matter." However, this uplifting moment gets immediately undermined by Peter shouting, "Shut up, Meg, you don't matter," from another room, demonstrating how the show consistently sabotages opportunities for genuine character growth or emotional resonance. The legal battle between Duff and Pawtucket Patriot Beer creates the episode's central conflict while providing commentary on corporate intellectual property disputes. The revelation that Pawtucket Patriot is simply relabeled Duff Beer exposes the brewery's fraudulent practices, but the episode treats this discovery as primarily affecting Peter's friendship with Homer, rather than focusing on the economic impact on Quohog's largest employer. The climactic fight between Peter and Homer escalates to absurd proportions involving nuclear radiation, supernatural regeneration, and destruction of Springfield landmarks. This extended battle sequence parodies action movie tropes while demonstrating how animated characters can engage in extreme violence without permanent consequences, ultimately treating massive destruction and attempted murder as temporary inconveniences. The episode's treatment of sexual content becomes particularly problematic during the car wash sequence, where Peter and Homer perform in revealing clothing for paying customers. This scene treats sex work as comedic, while the characters gyrate suggestively and spray water on themselves in ways clearly designed to titillate viewers, reducing both characters to sexual objects for audience entertainment. Most concerning throughout the episode is the normalization of inappropriate adult behavior around children, including Herbert's continued predatory interest in Chris, Stewie's torture of Nelson, and various sexual references made in the presence of minor characters. The episode treats these elements as standard Family Guy humor rather than recognizing them as depictions of child endangerment requiring intervention. The resolution returns both families to their respective towns, with minimal consequences for the chaos they caused, reinforcing the show's pattern of avoiding accountability for destructive behavior. Peter's comic strip controversy disappears without meaningful resolution, suggesting that public outrage over harmful content naturally subsides rather than requiring genuine change or accountability from content creators. The episode's meta-commentary about crossovers being driven by marketing rather than creative priorities proves prescient, given the episode's own commercial motivations, yet this self-awareness fails to elevate the actual content beyond crude humor and problematic stereotypes. The crossover succeeds as a television event while failing to provide meaningful commentary on the media landscape it supposedly critiques. The Simpsons Guy features the Griffin family fleeing to Springfield after Peter's sexist comic strip showing a man throwing a woman onto a counter yelling, "My dishwasher broke," causes public outrage, leading to encounters with the Simpsons characters including Stewie kidnapping and torturing Bart's bully Nelson with jumper cables while forcing him to literally eat my shorts, Peter and Homer performing sexual car wash services for paying customers, and an extended nuclear-powered fight that destroys Springfield landmarks, ultimately treating domestic violence jokes, child torture, sex work, and massive destruction as comedy, while providing meta-commentary about TV crossovers being marketing-driven rather than creative endeavors. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to viewer mail #2. Family Guy's Viewer Mail number 2 episode presents multiple short segments in response to supposed viewer requests, combining a Robin Williams tribute with disturbing sexual content involving minors and crude humor that treats inappropriate adult-child interactions as comedy material. The anthology format allows the show to pack multiple problematic scenarios into a single episode while using the viewer mail premise to deflect responsibility for controversial content choices. The episode begins with what appears to be a British variation segment featuring British Meg and a character named Neville, who injures himself and responds with repeated profanity. This opening establishes the episode's crude tone while introducing alternate versions of familiar characters, suggesting the anthology will explore different interpretations or cultural variations of the Griffin family dynamics. The Robin Williams tribute sequence shows Peter addressing multiple copies of the deceased comedian's characters, declaring, "Oh captains, my captains," before announcing their freedom from various fictional obligations. Peter tells them, "You are all free. You've been fired from the school. Vietnam is over. The hospital is closing. Will hunting is all better." This attempt at honoring Williams' filmography treats his iconic roles as burdensome imprisonments, requiring liberation rather than celebrating his artistic contributions. When bearded Robin Williams characters respond with "It's not your fault," references from Good Will Hunting, Peter dismisses them with, "Shut up, seriously, shut up, please, you are done here. Go and spread your comedy somewhere else." This hostile treatment of the tribute characters undermines any respectful intent, while suggesting that Williams's legacy has become an annoying obligation rather than something worth celebrating. The most concerning content appears in the diaper-changing scene between Lois and Stewie, which contains inappropriate sexual undertones and verbal abuse. Stewie's responses to routine childcare include, "Fuck you," calling Lois a white trash hen, and threatening future abandonment by declaring, "When I grow up, I'm never gonna call you. I'm gonna be busy with my job and my family. You'll be nothing." During the diaper change, Stewie makes crude observations about Lois's coffee consumption and eating habits while she performs intimate childcare duties. His comment about her ridiculous roots, combined with hair-grabbing behavior, creates uncomfortable dynamics between mother and infant that treat childcare as an opportunity for verbal assault and physical aggression. Quagmire's interaction with Stewie represents the episode's most disturbing content when he approaches the infant character saying, "Hey kid, come here. I want to see if I can still smell your mom's boobs on your mouth." This dialogue explicitly sexualizes breastfeeding while treating infant feeding as material for adult sexual gratification, crossing clear boundaries regarding appropriate content involving minors. Stewie's response telling Quagmire to go and hump a pile of garbage demonstrates his awareness of sexual content while positioning him as somehow sophisticated enough to reject adult advances. However, this dynamic treats inappropriate adult behavior toward children as acceptable if the child character responds negatively, rather than recognizing that adults should not make sexual comments to minors regardless of responses. Herbert's appearance continues the pattern of adults making inappropriate approaches to children, with Herbert greeting Stewie as "little fella" and commenting on the lovely day. Stewie's warning to stay away from my brother's butt explicitly references sexual threats toward Chris, while treating predatory behavior as an ongoing family concern rather than criminal conduct requiring intervention. The bedtime story parody features Lois reading what appears to be a dark version of Goodnight Moon, with references to Flour Mill, abandoned warehouse where you dance when you're mad, church where you slap your daughter, and Kevin Bacon's life savings that he invested with Bernie Madoff. This twisted children's literature combines child abuse references with financial fraud, treating both as appropriate bedtime content. These disturbing bedtime story elements treat domestic violence, church, where you slap your daughter, and financial victimization as suitable material for infant entertainment, demonstrating how the episode normalizes serious problems through inappropriate contexts. The casual inclusion of child abuse in bedtime routines suggests these behaviors are common enough to warrant inclusion in children's literature parodies. The anthology format allows the episode to present multiple problematic scenarios without developing any of them sufficiently to address their implications. Rather than exploring the consequences of inappropriate adult behavior or child abuse references, the show treats these elements as brief comedy sketches that reset without lasting impact or accountability. Most problematically, the episode presents a sustained pattern of adults making sexual or threatening comments to child characters, while treating these interactions as normal family dynamics rather than recognizing them as depicting child endangerment. The combination of Quagmire's sexual comments, Herbert's predatory approach, and casual abuse references creates an environment where threats to children are normalized through humor. The Robin Williams tribute gets overshadowed by the inappropriate content, suggesting that even attempts at respectful celebrity homages cannot escape the show's compulsion to include offensive material. The juxtaposition of honoring a beloved comedian with sexual references involving infants demonstrates the show's inability to maintain appropriate boundaries even during supposedly tribute-focused content. Viewer Mail Gnome 2 presents multiple segments including a Robin Williams tribute, where Peter dismisses the comedian's characters with "shut up, seriously, shut up," while featuring disturbing content like Quagmire telling infant Stewie, "I want to see if I can still smell your mom's boobs on your mouth," Herbert approaching children inappropriately, and Lois reading twisted bedtime stories about church where you slap your daughter, ultimately normalizing inappropriate adult-child interactions and sexual references involving minors through supposed comedy, treating child endangerment as routine family dynamics. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Seahorse Seashell Party. Family Guy's Seahorse Seashell Party episode traps the Griffin family during Hurricane Flozell, leading to Meg's explosive confrontation about years of family abuse before the episode undermines her valid criticisms through a manipulative resolution that reinforces harmful dynamics. The episode demonstrates the show's pattern of raising serious issues about domestic dysfunction only to dismiss them through false reconciliation that protects abusive behavior patterns. The episode begins during a hurricane when the family loses television access, creating forced intimacy that reveals underlying tensions. Peter's disappointment about missing Jose, and his fixation on Brian, drinking water, establishes his childish priorities, while the storm traps everyone together. The loss of external distractions forces characters to confront their relationships without the usual escape mechanisms that normally prevent honest communication. Meg's initial criticism of Chris's betrayal as her brother creates the catalyst for her larger confrontation with family dynamics. She points out how Chris consistently sides against her instead of providing sibling support, calling him a bastard for joining the family's pattern of scapegoating her. Her frustration about Chris treating her like "you hate me" and saying hurtful things constantly reflects genuine sibling abuse patterns that the episode initially treats seriously. When Meg retaliates by calling Chris a fat, zitty loser who has no friends and smells like an old woman who has birds for pets, she demonstrates how abuse victims can internalize cruel language and redirect it toward others. Her question, "What if I said those things to you?" attempts to create empathy by reversing their typical dynamic, though Chris's explosive response shows his inability to recognize the double standard. Lois's dismissive response that Meg is just taking your own problems out on everyone else represents classic victim-blaming behavior that ignores the family's role in creating Meg's problems. This deflection technique treats Meg's legitimate complaints as personal failings rather than responses to mistreatment, demonstrating how dysfunctional families maintain harmful patterns by gaslighting victims who speak up. Meg's counterattack against Lois exposes her mother's hypocritical judgment by listing past behaviors, including shoplifting, drug addiction, pornography, and sexual encounters with Gene Simmons and Bill Clinton. Her observation that Lois has the nerve, the arrogance to consistently and ruthlessly point out my shortcomings, despite her own irresponsible, reckless, idiotic behavior, reveals the family's double standards about moral authority. The episode's most powerful moment comes when Meg articulates the fundamental betrayal of trust between parent and child. "From the moment you gave birth to me, I had to trust you. I had no choice. I needed you to protect me from the world, to be my guide, to help me navigate the difficult, confusing, and vulnerable journey to becoming a person. You have done none of those things." This speech accurately describes parental responsibility while highlighting how Lois failed in her most basic duties as a mother. Meg's description of Lois taking a child's trust and smashed it into bits in a 17-year-long mission to destroy something that you killed a long time ago demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how chronic emotional abuse damages children's development and self-worth. Meg's threat that, "when I turn 18, I don't know that I ever want to see you again," represents a healthy boundary-setting response to abuse, showing her recognition that she has options beyond accepting continued mistreatment. This moment suggests character growth and self-advocacy that could lead to genuine change in family dynamics. However, the episode immediately undermines Meg's valid criticisms when Lois begins crying and Peter whispers instructions for Meg to continue her attacks. This revelation that Peter orchestrated the confrontation reduces Meg's genuine grievances to entertainment, treating her emotional pain as a performance rather than recognizing her legitimate complaints about family dysfunction. Meg's subsequent attack on Peter accurately identifies his failures as a father, calling him fat, lazy, abusive, and pointing out his impulsive escapades and treatment of his family. Her observation that, "If someone in the outside world could see the way you treat me, you would be in jail," correctly identifies Peter's behavior as criminal rather than comedic, demonstrating awareness that their family dynamics are not normal. The description of Peter as someone who has lived half your life and you have nothing to show for it, except children who are a disaster, provides accurate assessment of his destructive impact on his family. Meg's conclusion that Peter is a waste of a man represents justified anger about his consistent failures as a father and husband. Peter's response that these are criticisms reveals his expectation that family interactions should only include praise, showing his inability to accept accountability for his behavior. His request for Lois to make Meg knock it off demonstrates how he expects protection from consequences while continuing harmful behavior patterns. The episode's most problematic element emerges in its resolution, where Meg suddenly reverses her position and takes responsibility for the entire confrontation. Her declaration that, "It's all my fault," followed by apologies to each family member, represents a complete betrayal of her earlier insights about family dysfunction. Meg's retraction that her criticisms were out of anger and that she didn't mean any of them invalidates every valid point she raised about abuse and neglect. Her self-blame for being a rotten sister and her assertion that her family members have done nothing wrong directly contradicts the evidence she presented about their mistreatment. This false resolution reinforces the family's scapegoating pattern by having Meg accept blame for problems she didn't create while absolving actual perpetrators of responsibility for their behavior. The episode teaches viewers that victims who speak up about abuse should ultimately apologize for causing discomfort rather than expecting change from their abusers. Most disturbingly, the episode treats Meg's accurate assessment of family dysfunction as something requiring apology rather than validation. By having her retract true statements about abuse and neglect, the show suggests that maintaining family harmony is more important than addressing harmful behavior or protecting victims. Seahorse Seashell Party features Meg confronting her family during a hurricane, accurately describing years of abuse, including Lois's failure as a mother who took a child's trust and smashed it into bits, and Peter's behavior that would put him in jail if outsiders witnessed it. Before the episode undermines her valid criticisms by having Meg suddenly declare, "It's all my fault," and apologize to her abusers, ultimately reinforcing toxic family dynamics by teaching that abuse victims should retract true statements about mistreatment to maintain false harmony. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to 420, Family Guy's 420 episode uses marijuana legalization as its central theme, while opening with Peter's accidental murder of Quagmire's pet cat, demonstrating how the show treats animal cruelty and drug policy as equally suitable subjects for crude humor. The episode combines advocacy for cannabis legalization with disturbing content that normalizes violence against animals while treating serious legal and ethical issues as temporary plot conveniences. The episode begins when Peter, Brian, Cleveland, and Joe become jealous of Quagmire's attention to his new cat James, leading them to plan a prank involving shaving the animal. This setup treats animal abuse as harmless mischief while ignoring the psychological trauma that forced grooming causes pets. The escalation to Peter accidentally killing the cat with a razor transforms animal cruelty into supposedly comedic accident, treating a living creature's death as slapstick humor. Peter and Brian's decision to hide the cat's body and lie to Quagmire about it running away demonstrates conspiracy to cover up animal cruelty while causing emotional distress to the pet owner. Their plan to deceive Quagmire about his pet's fate treats grief and worry as acceptable costs for avoiding accountability. This plotline normalizes both animal abuse and the subsequent lies needed to cover up violent actions. The police response to discovering the dead cat reveals the episode's problematic priorities when officers completely ignore Peter's animal murder, but immediately arrest Brian for marijuana possession. This contrast suggests that drug possession deserves more serious legal consequences than animal cruelty, reflecting misplaced law enforcement priorities while treating pet killing as less significant than cannabis use. Brian's arrest and probation create the episode's main marijuana legalization storyline, with his initial attempt to cheat his drug test using Stewie's urine demonstrating dishonest approaches to legal compliance. When caught by Lois, Brian faces a choice between accountability and continued deception, ultimately choosing to advocate for legal change rather than personal responsibility for his actions. The musical number promoting marijuana legalization allows the episode to present pro-cannabis arguments through enthusiastic performance, highlighting supposed benefits like reduced crime and increased productivity. This advocacy approach treats complex drug policy issues as simple solutions while ignoring potential negative consequences or the complexity of addiction and substance abuse disorders. The episode's portrayal of universal marijuana acceptance following legalization presents an unrealistic scenario where entire communities adopt substance use without negative consequences. References to increased Doctor Who ratings and Peter being too wasted to make up a cutaway gag treat widespread intoxication as primarily positive, while ignoring impairment effects on judgment, motor skills, and daily functioning. Carter Pewterschmidt's financial motivation for opposing marijuana legalization provides commentary on how economic interests drive drug policy rather than public health concerns. His timber industry losses due to hemp competition demonstrate how established industries resist change that threatens their profits, regardless of potential social benefits from alternative policies. Brian's corruption through Carter's bribe involving his novel publication reveals how personal ambition can compromise principled positions. The promise of literary success through fraudulent means, including a fake Oprah endorsement, shows how individuals can be manipulated into abandoning their stated beliefs when offered personal benefits that appeal to their stated biased vanity. The episode's resolution, where Brian reverses his marijuana advocacy for personal gain, demonstrates the hollow nature of his supposed principles. His willingness to campaign against something he previously supported shows that his activism was self-serving rather than based on genuine conviction about drug policy or social justice. The critical failure of Brian's published novel serves as punishment for his sellout behavior, but the episode suggests that, at least, he accomplished something by getting marijuana banned again. This moral framework treats restriction of personal freedom as inherently positive while ignoring the harm caused by criminalization policies that Brian had previously criticized. Most disturbingly, the episode concludes with Peter casually admitting to Quagmire that he killed his cat while collecting a reward for the missing pet. This revelation treats animal murder as a minor inconvenience while Peter profits from his crime and deception. The door slamming prevents Quagmire from responding, denying him the opportunity to seek justice for his pet's death. The episode's treatment of animal cruelty as secondary to drug policy issues reflects problematic priorities that normalize violence against vulnerable creatures. By focusing viewer attention on marijuana legalization debates while treating pet murder as background humor, the show suggests that policy discussions matter more than preventing actual harm to living beings. The contrast between extensive legal consequences for marijuana possession and complete impunity for animal killing demonstrates how the episode critiques drug enforcement while simultaneously normalizing violence against animals. This selective concern for justice issues reveals the show's inability to consistently apply ethical principles across different types of harmful behavior. 420 features Peter accidentally killing Quagmire's cat James with a razor during a planned prank, before hiding the body and lying about the pet running away, while police ignore the animal murder but arrest Brian for marijuana possession, leading to his campaign for cannabis legalization that succeeds until he's bribed to reverse his position with promises of novel publication, ultimately ending with Peter casually admitting he killed the cat while collecting a reward from the still grieving Quagmire, normalizing animal cruelty while treating drug policy as more serious than pet murder. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to The Courtship of Stewie's Father. Family Guy's The Courtship of Stewie's Father episode takes the Griffin family to Disney World while featuring deeply disturbing content including Herbert's sexual excitement about children's sports, Peter exposing Stewie to strip clubs, and casual references to political violence. The episode demonstrates the show's pattern of treating child endangerment as comedy while normalizing inappropriate adult behavior toward minors. The episode opens with Herbert watching ESPN's Little League World Series coverage and exclaiming, "Jackpot," in obvious sexual excitement about viewing young boys play baseball. This reaction treats children's sporting events as material for adult sexual gratification, presenting predatory behavior toward minors as harmless comedy rather than recognizing it as depicting criminal interest in children. Stewie's excitement about Disney World provides typical child enthusiasm, but his comment that he's still mad at you toward Peter maintains their relationship tension. This dynamic suggests that even exciting destinations cannot resolve deeper family conflicts, while setting up Peter's misguided attempts to bond with his son through inappropriate means. The Michael Eisner reference featuring Kali Ma chanting parodies Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom while commenting on corporate greed through Peter's accusation that Eisner betrayed the shareholders. This sequence treats executive compensation and corporate responsibility as material for adventure movie parodies, rather than serious business ethics issues. The Dutch prisoner sequence at Disney World depicts Stewie chained and forced to sing "It's a Small World," under threat of starring in A Christmas Movie with Tim Allen. This scenario treats child imprisonment and coercion as theme park entertainment, while using celebrity mockery to threaten compliance with demands. Most disturbing is the strip club sequence where Peter takes Stewie to an adult entertainment venue, exposing a toddler to explicit sexual performances. Stewie's observation that Tuesday afternoon is not exactly their A squad, and his mention of seeing bullet wounds treats child exposure to sex work and violence as sophisticated cultural commentary, rather than recognizing it as serious abuse. Lois's question about whether Peter took Stewie to a strip club, noting that he smells like sweat and fear, demonstrates parental awareness of inappropriate activities while treating the situation as primarily annoying rather than criminal. Her fury at Peter focuses on disobedience to her bonding instructions rather than child endangerment. The episode's political content includes Stewie's comment that, "Somewhere in this state, right now, Jeb Bush is eating a live puppy," treating political figures as cartoon villains, while normalizing extreme violence toward animals as casual political commentary. This approach reduces complex political criticism to absurd caricature. Peter's inability to distinguish between his children, asking about the fat one or the funny-looking one, demonstrates his disconnection from his family while treating parental neglect as comedic character trait. Chris's delayed realization that his father called him fat reveals how children internalize parental cruelty even when initially defending siblings. The episode's treatment of Disney World as a corporate entity capable of imprisoning and torturing customers reflects broader concerns about theme park commercialization while using child endangerment scenarios as comedy material. The combination of legitimate corporate criticism with inappropriate content involving minors undermines any meaningful commentary. Throughout the episode, Peter's attempts to bond with Stewie through adult activities demonstrate his complete misunderstanding of appropriate father-son relationships. Rather than recognizing children's developmental needs and safety requirements, Peter treats Stewie as a miniature adult, capable of handling adult situations and environments. Most problematically, the episode normalizes multiple forms of child endangerment through Herbert's predatory behavior, Peter's strip club visit, and various scenarios depicting minors in threatening situations. The casual treatment of these elements suggests that inappropriate adult-child interactions are primarily comedic rather than serious safety concerns. The episode fails to address the psychological impact of exposing children to adult entertainment, violence, or predatory behavior. Instead, treating these experiences as character-building adventures that sophisticated children can handle with wit and commentary. The courtship of Stewie's father features Herbert exclaiming "jackpot" while watching Little League coverage in obvious sexual excitement about viewing young boys, Peter taking toddler Stewie to a strip club where he observes that Tuesday afternoon is not exactly their A squad and sees bullet wounds, while Disney World sequences show Stewie chained and forced to perform under threat, ultimately normalizing predatory behavior toward children and treating exposure of minors to adult entertainment venues as father-son bonding rather than child endangerment. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. If you're 5, moving on, we have Partial Terms of Endearment. Family Guy's Partial Terms of Endearment episode tackles abortion politics while featuring extremely disturbing content including rape jokes, incest implications, and graphic sexual references involving family members. The episode represents one of the show's most problematic attempts at political commentary, treating reproductive rights as comedy material, while including content that crosses every boundary of appropriate television content. The episode opens with crude sexual dialogue, including Stewie telling someone, "You're treating your vagina like a Red Roof Inn," reducing female anatomy to commercial lodging metaphors, while treating sexual activity as transactional rather than intimate. This opening establishes the episode's approach to reproductive themes through crude objectification of women's bodies. The most disturbing content emerges when Lois jokes that it was hard enough on your body when you gave birth to Stewie while speaking to Meg, implying an incestuous relationship where Meg gave birth to her brother. Although Lois claims to be just jokin', this reference treats incest and underage pregnancy as appropriate subjects for family humor while normalizing discussions of sexual abuse between siblings. The Count's appearance during Meg's topless scene demonstrates the episode's willingness to sexualize the teenage character while using Sesame Street parodies to make inappropriate content seem more acceptable. His counting of nipples before declaring, "Oh hell no, I'm outta here," treats the exposure of a minor's body as comedy material while suggesting that even fictional characters recognize the inappropriateness. Peter's response to questions about rape exceptions reveals his complete disconnection from reality when he suggests that rape victims should have thought of that before she asked me for directions. This response, treats sexual assault as something women cause through innocent interactions, while demonstrating Peter's inability to understand consent or personal safety. The episode's most shocking moment occurs when Peter casually mentions starting an orgy, treating group sexual activity as normal family planning discussion. His matter-of-fact delivery suggests that explicit sexual arrangements are routine conversation topics, while Lois's confused response indicates this represents escalated inappropriate behavior, even by Griffin family standards. Lois's revelation about her college experimentation with her friend Naomi leads to Peter's enthusiastic celebration of his wife's same-sex experiences, reducing lesbian relationships to male sexual fantasies. His prayer of gratitude to God for this revelation treats women's sexual orientation as existing primarily for male entertainment rather than recognizing authentic emotional connections. God's direct response with a chorus singing, "He knows what turns you on," reinforces the treatment of divine intervention as primarily concerned with sexual gratification rather than moral guidance or spiritual development. This portrayal reduces religious faith to sexual wish fulfillment while treating sacred relationships as comedy material. Peter's declaration that he's here to save the unborn, followed immediately by, "Once they get out of the vagina, they can go fuck themselves," reveals the hypocrisy in anti-abortion activism that focuses on fetal life while ignoring child welfare after birth. This critique provides valid commentary on inconsistent pro-life positions, but delivers it through crude language that undermines the serious point. The episode's conclusion features Lois delivering a sincere speech about the joys and challenges of having children, describing the costs and rewards of raising another person. Her emotional reflection on sharing the world with one more Griffin to love and to love us in return provides genuine sentiment about family expansion and parental love. However, the episode immediately undermines this heartfelt moment when Peter breaks the fourth wall to tell viewers, "We had the abortion," revealing that all the previous emotional content was deceptive. This twist treats viewers' emotional investment as a joke while suggesting that abortion decisions are primarily about fooling audiences rather than serious reproductive choices. Most problematically, the episode uses abortion as a punchline delivery mechanism rather than engaging seriously with reproductive rights debates. The fake-out ending treats termination decisions as gotcha moments for audience surprise, rather than recognizing them as complex personal choices with significant emotional and ethical implications. The combination of rape jokes, incest references, and abortion humor creates an episode that manages to offend multiple communities while failing to provide meaningful commentary on any of the serious issues it raises. The show's approach treats reproductive politics as primarily comedic rather than acknowledging the real-world impact of these policies on women's lives and health. Partial Terms of Endearment features Lois joking that Meg previously gave birth to Stewie in apparent incest reference, Peter suggesting rape victims should have thought of that before she asked me for directions, casual mentions of family orgies, and Peter declaring he'll save the unborn, but once they get out of the vagina, they can go fuck themselves. Ending with Lois giving a heartfelt speech about the joys of having children before Peter tells viewers, "We had the abortion," treating reproductive rights as punchline material while including incest jokes and sexual violence references. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to The Thin White Line. Family Guy's The Thin White Line episode addresses addiction through Brian's cocaine dependency while featuring Peter's fraudulent rehabilitation scheme, demonstrating the show's tendency to treat serious mental health issues as comedy material rather than acknowledging the genuine suffering and recovery challenges associated with substance abuse disorders. The episode begins with Brian seeking therapy for an emotional rut, leading his doctor to suggest volunteer work as treatment for excessive self-focus. This therapeutic approach reflects legitimate mental health interventions that encourage outward engagement to combat depression and anxiety, showing the episode's initial attempt to portray realistic treatment recommendations. Brian's progression from guide dog work to police drug detection provides character development through meaningful service, but the setup inevitably leads to his accidental cocaine exposure during airport duty. His inadvertent consumption while successfully identifying a suitcase of drugs creates the central addiction storyline, while treating substance abuse initiation as workplace accident rather than exploring underlying psychological vulnerabilities. The escalation of Brian's cocaine addiction demonstrates some realistic progression patterns, with his initial success as a police dog giving way to mounting personal problems and eventual family intervention. However, the show's comedic approach undermines the serious nature of addiction by focusing on humorous situations rather than the genuine psychological and physical suffering that accompanies substance abuse disorders. The family intervention sequence treats addiction recovery as primarily inconvenient for vacation planning rather than focusing on Brian's health and safety. Peter's disappointment about canceling their cruise reduces addiction treatment to a logistical obstacle while prioritizing recreational activities over necessary medical care, demonstrating a fundamental misunderstanding of how addiction affects families. Peter's decision to fake his own addiction to access luxury rehabilitation amenities represents the episode's most problematic element, treating addiction treatment as vacation opportunity rather than recognizing it as medical necessity for people suffering from substance abuse disorders. His scheme trivializes the legitimate need for professional treatment while suggesting that rehabilitation facilities are essentially expensive resorts. The portrayal of the rehabilitation facility as luxurious accommodations rather than medical treatment centers perpetuates harmful stereotypes about addiction recovery. This presentation suggests that people seek treatment for comfort rather than health, undermining public understanding of how difficult and necessary rehabilitation can be for those struggling with substance abuse. Peter's disruptive behavior at the facility creates additional problems for Brian's recovery process, demonstrating how family dysfunction can interfere with treatment outcomes. However, the episode treats these disruptions as comedic, rather than acknowledging how family interference can genuinely harm recovery efforts and endanger someone's health. The doctors claim that Peter represents the X factor responsible for driving Brian to addiction, provides oversimplified causation that ignores the complex biological, psychological, and social factors that contribute to substance abuse disorders. This explanation treats addiction as primarily caused by external relationships rather than recognizing it as a complex medical condition requiring comprehensive treatment. Brian's decision to leave rehabilitation prematurely due to the doctor's comments demonstrates how external blame can undermine personal responsibility in recovery. His indignant exit with Peter treats addiction treatment as something that can be abandoned when inconvenient rather than recognizing it as ongoing medical necessity. Most concerning is Brian's final declaration about personal destiny and his decision to leave the family, treating recovery as primarily about individual will, rather than acknowledging the importance of support systems, ongoing treatment, and professional medical care. This portrayal reinforces harmful myths about addiction recovery that suggest people can simply choose sobriety without comprehensive treatment. The episode's ending with Brian leaving in a taxi while the family watches passively treats his departure as dramatic television rather than a concerning development for someone who just left treatment prematurely. This presentation suggests that incomplete recovery is acceptable if it creates compelling storylines. The to-be-continued format treats Brian's addiction and incomplete recovery as entertainment cliffhanger rather than serious medical situation requiring ongoing attention and care. This approach prioritizes dramatic tension over realistic portrayal of addiction recovery processes. Throughout the episode, the show fails to acknowledge the real suffering associated with addiction, the importance of completing treatment programs, or the ongoing nature of recovery. Instead, it treats these serious issues as temporary plot devices that can be resolved through individual determination rather than comprehensive medical and psychological support. The Thin White Line features Brian developing cocaine addiction while working as a police drug dog, leading to family intervention and rehabilitation that gets disrupted when Peter fakes his own addiction to enjoy the facility's luxury amenities, ultimately resulting in Brian leaving treatment prematurely after being blamed as the cause of his addiction problems, with the episode treating substance abuse recovery as comedy material rather than acknowledging the serious medical nature of addiction disorders and the importance of completing professional treatment. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Fresh Air. Family Guy's Fresh Air episode features some of the show's most disturbing content, including Peter's imprisoned hairless twin, incestuous marriage proposals between Peter and Chris, graphic violence involving severed heads, and sexual content involving minors. This episode demonstrates the show's willingness to cross every ethical boundary while treating serious crimes and family dysfunction as comedy material. The episode opens with Peter dismissing Chris's request for father-son bonding time unless Chris is a television set or the internet, establishing his priorities while revealing his complete disconnection from parental responsibilities. This rejection sets up the manipulative relationship dynamics that drive the episode's disturbing plot developments. Peter's hairless twin subplot represents one of the episode's most concerning elements, depicting what appears to be imprisonment and abuse of a family member. The twins' plea to "close the door, the moonlight burns" suggests severe medical neglect, while Peter's promise of eggshells and coffee grounds for Christmas treats, basic sustenance as reward for compliance, rather than recognizing fundamental human rights. When the twin asks to meet the family, Peter's response that "you overstepped, no Christmas" treats family contact as privilege to be withdrawn rather than basic human connection. This dynamic depicts false imprisonment and isolation abuse, while the episode presents these criminal behaviors as quirky family secrets rather than serious felonies requiring intervention. The sexual education sequence involving Chris teaching Carter about masturbation crosses inappropriate boundaries by depicting a minor providing explicit sexual instruction to an adult family member. Carter's amazed responses and questions about frequency normalize inappropriate sexual discussions between children and adults while treating sexual education as comedy rather than recognizing proper boundaries. Carter's enthusiastic reaction and declaration that the experience was amazing, followed by his interest in trying "with my hand" next time, treats sexual instruction from a minor as positive development rather than recognizing it as inappropriate adult-child interaction requiring immediate intervention. The escaped twin sequence escalates to violence when Peter cocks a gun upon discovering the escape, followed by the revelation that the twin now holds the weapon while declaring, "Let's eat all the garbage we want." This scenario treats family violence and weapons access as comedy while depicting dangerous situations involving firearms and unstable individuals. Peter's will manipulation subplot involves him threatening Carter with disinheritance while accidentally destroying his own birth certificate, leading to his dramatic declaration about seeing no light. "There's only fire." This sequence treats legal documents and personal identity as interchangeable while using existential terror as comedy material. Brian's attempt to convince Carter to donate money to charity reveals his fraudulent advocacy when he cannot name a single legitimate organization, instead stammering about Poor Green Whale Gun's books. This scene critiques performative activism, while the cutaway showing an armed whale asking, "Why won't anyone help us?" treats charitable causes as absurd rather than recognizing genuine need. The Alzheimer's disease subplot involves Peter planning to research this fictional condition, with a cutaway showing him holding bloody objects that Lois identifies as testicles, while Peter sobs, "I don't remember." This sequence treats medical research as excuse for graphic violence, while depicting memory loss and genital mutilation as comedy material. Most disturbing is Peter's casual presentation of a severed head to Chris, claiming it belongs to his school bully. Chris's horrified response that it's the deaf kid, whom Peter mistook for using terrible karate, when the victim was actually using sign language treats disability, murder, and hate crimes as misunderstandings, rather than recognizing them as serious violence, requiring legal consequences. The episode's central plot involves Peter proposing marriage to his own son, Chris, with Peter claiming such unions are legal in Vermont because, as long as it's a man and a man, anything goes up there. This dialogue treats same-sex marriage rights as equivalent to incestuous relationships while promoting false information about marriage laws and LGBTQ+ rights. Peter's dismissal of traditional marriage as just all of human history, except for the last 5 months, demonstrates his complete misunderstanding of both marriage traditions and recent legal changes, while treating millennia of human relationships as temporary inconveniences to his incestuous schemes. Chris's reasonable questioning about whether men are supposed to marry women gets dismissed through Peter's manipulation, with the episode treating incestuous proposals as legitimate relationship options rather than recognizing them as criminal behavior and psychological abuse of a minor child. The episode's conclusion, with Joe grabbing his son Kevin's hand after witnessing Peter's plan, accompanied by Kevin's protest, "No, Dad," and Joe's declaration that he doesn't know what normal is anymore, treats child sexual abuse as contagious behavior that spreads through exposure, rather than recognizing it as criminal conduct requiring intervention. Fresh Air features Peter keeping a hairless twin imprisoned who feeds on eggshells and coffee grounds. Chris teaching grandfather Carter about masturbation, with Carter declaring it amazing. Peter presenting Chris with a severed head, claiming it's his bully, but actually being the deaf kid whom Peter killed, mistaking sign language for terrible karate. And Peter proposing marriage to his son Chris, claiming it's legal in Vermont, as long as it's a man and a man, ultimately treating incest, imprisonment, murder, and child sexual abuse as comedy while normalizing extreme criminal behavior through supposed humor.